You can start now.
Good evening and welcome to day 5 of Tamil Heritage Trust 2023 Indology Festival, Sagara Sangamam. For those of you who have stayed with us the last 4 days and followed our programs, thank you for joining us once again. And for those of us who joined us today, welcome. And we hope that you get a chance to watch our previous days programs on YouTube. Tamil Heritage Trust is a not-for-profit, volunteer-driven organization that has been functioning for the last 13 years, performing a lot of work in the field of Indian heritage. If you wish to know more about our activities, you can do so by visiting our website, www.tamilheritage.in. Our Facebook page is Tamil Heritage Trust. Our Twitter handle is Tamil Heritage TN. If you wish to receive notifications of our email notification of all our programs, you may do so by sending us an email to admin@tamilheritage.in, and you should be able to receive notification of all our future programs. We wish to make an announcement today. In last year, 2022, Tamil Heritage Trust hosted the V. Venkaya Epigraphy Award, which was instituted by the family of Sri V. Venkaya, the great epigraphist. The award was intended to recognize individuals who have made outstanding contributions in the field of epigraphy. These are people who have made contributions towards discovery or rediscovery of inscriptions, interpretation of inscriptions from a different perspective, and or disseminating the knowledge contained in these inscriptions through the print or digital medium, or reaching out or disseminating this knowledge to the larger public. So this award was instituted in 2022, and Tamil Heritage has hosted this along with Mrs. Sunita Madhavan from Sri V. Venkaya's family. The inaugural award was given to Dr. Y. Subrayulu, epigraphist, and he's going to be the speaker tomorrow. He's going to be speaking to us tomorrow on day 6 of this program. So he was awarded the first award in 2022. We hosted the award once again in 2023. We had a jury comprising of erudite members, people who have worked in the field of epigraphy around India. Our jury members are Dr. Suman Jain, Professor Paleography and Epigraphy from the Banaras Hindu University. Dr. Devarakonda Reddy, retired Professor, Epigraphy Department, Karnataka University, Hampi. Dr. S. Swaminathan, Deputy Superintending Epigraphist, retired epigraphist from Mysore. And Mr. K. Sridharan, retired Deputy Superintendent Archaeologist from the Department of Archaeology, Tamil Nadu Government. So we had a panel of scholars, epigraphists who worked in this field, who decided the winner of the 2023 Epigraphy Award, V. Venkaya Epigraphy Award. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are happy to announce the winner of the 2023 award. The 2023 award goes to Dr. P.V. Krishnamurthy. We are honored to be presenting the award to Dr. P.V. Krishnamurthy. A few words about Dr. Krishnamurthy. Dr. Krishnamurthy received his PhD in the year 2000 from the Kannada University in Hampi. His PhD was for his study of Banarasa's inscriptions, so inscriptions of the Bana kings. Dr. Krishnamurthy has held various positions. He was an honorable lecturer in epigraphy at the Kannada Sahitya Parishad, a lecturer in manuscriptology, BM Sri Pratishtana and IGNCA Bengaluru. He teaches Kannada for non-Kannadigas, people who don't speak Kannada, on behalf of Government of Karnataka. Dr. Krishnamurthy has also, in the field of epigraphy and history, written, co-authored, translated, edited several publications and books. Some of his important books include the Tamil Nadina Kannada Shasanagalu, which means the Kannada inscriptions in Tamil Nadu. The third edition of that was published in 2018. So Dr. Krishnamurthy co-authored and edited the third edition of that. He has also written the Sugutru Veerashaiva Arasu Manetana. Another one of his works in history is Ane Nadu. So this is the ancient history of Anekal Taluk, which is in Bangalore. And he has also written, authored and co-authored several works in the Itihasa Darshana from the volumes 10 to 28. He has contributed to that publication for nearly 20 years. He has made rich contributions for over 19 volumes in the Karnataka Itihasa Academy, Bengaluru, and has published over 170 articles in various magazines and journals, in encyclopedia volumes, in scholarly journals, and so far. We are honored to be presenting the 2023 edition of the V. Venkaya Epigraphy Award to Dr. P.V. Krishnamurthy. An announcement on the award receiving date will be made very soon. And after receiving the award, Dr. Krishnamurthy will also be delivering a lecture upon acceptance of the award. We wish to take this opportunity to thank the jury members who are involved in this process. And we also place a special thanks to Mr. Ravi Shankar of the Tamil Heritage Trust for coordinating and anchoring this entire award process. If you wish to stay connected on all our YouTube videos, you can do so by going on to YouTube, Tamil Heritage Trust, and you can find videos of all our past programs. If you wish to support us in the form of donations, financial support, you may do so by scanning this QR code or using our UPI ID, which is Tamil 98842 at Baroda MP. So that is our UPI ID and QR code that you see on the screen. Indology Festival. This is our third edition of our Indology Festival. We conducted our inaugural edition in 2020, followed by 2022. Here we are presenting the third edition of our Indology Festival, which we are celebrating over a period of 7 days. We have 14 scholars talking to us about various aspects of India's maritime history. This Indology Festival is aptly named Sagara Sangamam. We are celebrating India's rich connection with the sea. On day one, just a recap, we had Dr. Himanshu Prabhare delivering the keynote address. Following that, we had Dr. Sri Narsaya, who spoke to us about the maritime history with special reference to India. On day two, Dr. Yaduvir Singh Rawat lectured about the Harappan coastal settlements and their maritime connections. Following that, Dr. Chaya Goswami spoke about the Kutchi merchants who traveled to Arabia and East Africa. On day three, Dr. Selva Kumar from the Tamil University, Tanjavur, spoke to us about the ships and watercraft in ancient and medieval India. Following that, Dr. Pius spoke to us about the maritime history of the Malabar coast. Yesterday, day four, first up we had Swati Chemburkar, whose lecture was on the topic of Shaiva networks across maritime Asia. She spoke specifically about the Pashupada Shaivam and its impact in the Khmer temples in Cambodia. And last night, Dr. Anirudh Deshpande, Professor of Modern History, Delhi, lectured about the forgotten naval histories of early modern India. All our programs are available on YouTube. If you missed any of our previous day programs, please go watch them on YouTube. With that, we come to today's program, day 5. First, we have Dr. Andrea Acri. Andrea Acri is a PhD from the Leiden University. He received his PhD in 2011. He is an assistant professor in Tantric Studies at the EPHE PSL University and Adjunct Researcher at the École Française EEO in Paris. Prior to joining the EPHE in 2016, he has held various research and teaching positions in India, Singapore, Australia, and the Netherlands. He is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society and the Journal of Yoga Studies. His main research and teaching interests are Shaiva and Buddhist Tantric traditions in South and Southeast Asia, yoga studies, Sanskrit and Old Javanese philology, and Balinese Hinduism. His publications include the monographs Dharma Pa and Dari Siwaisme Jawa ke Agama Hindu Bali. Please pardon me if I've got that pronunciation wrong, as well as various edited volumes and peer-reviewed articles in international academic journals. Dr. Andrea, in his talk, Spread of Sanskritic Buddhism by Sea, will discuss the spread in two waves of Sanskritic, especially Tantric Buddhism, across maritime Asia during the medieval period. He will show how the sponsorship by royal elites of Buddhist monks led to the adoption of forms of Mahayana Buddhism, Buddhist Tantra in the region. With these few words, we welcome Dr. Andrea to deliver his lecture today.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I just share my screen. Okay, so I hope you are able to see in full screen.
Yes.
Very good. So thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. Yesterday, I watched the presentation by my friend and colleague, Swati Chamburkar. And so I just would like to start by saying that my presentation will be also a bit different in that it will focus on Southeast Asia rather than only South Asia. I try to speak about both South and Southeast Asia, and indeed about this geographically wide area that scholars call Maritime Asia. And so today I will speak about the spread of, let's say, Sanskritic Buddhism, and especially Tantric Buddhism. And the work I've been doing, what I will be presenting today, stems from a work, actually a collective effort by a number of scholars that I had the pleasure to work with over the past few years. And here you can see 3 edited volumes focusing on esoteric Buddhism, but also more generally about Hindu and Buddhist art, texts, etc. And especially this geographical area called Maritime Asia, which transcend the borders of nation states as we know them today, and also macro areas like South, Southeast Asia, East Asia, etc. And so basically what the approach that I've been, let's say, promoting over the past few years constitutes a marriage, so to speak, between Buddhist studies and maritime history. Now, the concept of Maritime Asia is an idea that was elaborated in French and German academic circles, as well as Japanese academic circles, around the 1990s. There was also earlier scholarship, but I think most of the work goes back to this decade. And I've been inspired during my stay in Singapore as a fellow at the Nalanda Srivijaya Center by a new wave of scholarship, especially in the work of Tan Sen Sam, Jason Nealis, Marcus Bingenheimer, on Buddhist networks. So this approach that focuses on networks, nodes, to study the spread, the diffusion of Buddhism. And especially also I've been using and doing some research as well on micro history of Buddhism in Indonesia, in what is now Indonesia, and especially in Java and Bali. Now, I think the importance, really the take-home idea today is the importance of having this wider geographical perspective. And so here you see a map, and the first map on the left represents the, let's say, the monsoon trade networks, the maritime Silk routes, which connected the Mediterranean world via the Red Sea of the Persian Gulf, all the way to Southeast Asia and East Asia, that is South China, and of course India and Sri Lanka were integral parts of the circuit. They were located right at the center. But these routes, these so-called Silk routes, were not just important for trade, but also for the circulation of ideas, of knowledge, and also religions. One of the religions that spread from India to Southeast Asia was, for instance, Shaivism. But Shaivism, Vaishnavism were not the only religions. Buddhism also was spread mainly by sea to the, let's say, areas that we now call Indonesia, mainland Southeast Asia, that is Thailand, Cambodia, and of course, China, and even further, Korea and Japan. Now, if you look at the map on the right, you can see the trade routes, both overland and maritime represented. But you can see a lot of red dots in the maritime portion, in the overland portion of this circuit, of this trade circuit. And those represents nodes, trade nodes, but also important centers of Buddhism, okay, especially those in India and Central Asia. And so you see how detailed this map by UNESCO has been really drawn, so with such a level of detail. But not so, as you can see, in the maritime section. So basically Southeast Asia, even India and great part of China do not have red dots. And that, I think, already reflects a certain bias, okay? Another bias that I think hampers our understanding of Buddhism on a Pan-Asian scale is the fact that often when we study Buddhism outside of India, we tend to indeed assume that India was the cradle, the origin, which exported Buddhist elements, texts, icons, etc. to the peripheries being, for example, Southeast Asia or China or Japan. But I think this is an old paradigm that really needs to be transcended, as we have more and more evidence also of the importance of the so-called peripheries. So what I suggest, as other scholars also have suggested before me, is to understand this phenomenon as a circulation that was polycentric. Okay, so just not a monodirectional, that is from India to Southeast Asia and East Asia, but also the other way around. So the transfer and transmissions from multiple centers, from multiple nodes in this great network, the large part of which was maritime. And so basically these many centers of Buddhism, we will see other maps shortly, existed in this area called Maritime Asia, and they were linked to each other, not only by trade routes, but also by contacts that were diplomatic, for example, religious, and even political. So another important dimension to study, to understand the phenomenon, are the social networks. And by social networks, I mean the lineages of masters, really the circle, the inner and outer circle, the disciples of the prominent masters, whose biographies are known thanks to the East Asian chronicles, for instance, the Chinese, and in some cases also the Tibetan biographies. And basically all this highlights the importance of maritime transfer, of Buddhism via the maritime routes. Now, and I would like to discuss a few maps that I found on the internet. And this is a map, again, that describes the spread of Buddhism to AD 600. And you see again how detailed this cartography is with respect to Buddhist centers in Central Asia, in India, Sri Lanka, and China, and how few details are found in Southeast Asia. So there are just these lines connecting the ports, but very few centers of Buddhism are found there. Now, if you look at this map by the Oxford Dictionary of Buddhism, you can see the color, the gray represents Mahayana Buddhism. This is a map about the spread of Mahayana Buddhism in Asia. And you see that Mahayana Buddhism includes China, part of Mongolia, Korea, Japan, Tibet, of course, and Nepal, and Vietnam in Southeast Asia. But everything else is basically white. And Indonesia, so the maritime Southeast Asia, area is completely out of the map, is not even represented. So, so to say that Mahayana did not reach those regions. Another similar map by Cornell University, you can see the neat distinction of Asia into 3 quadrants. India connected to Vajrayana Buddhism, that is esoteric or Tantric Buddhism, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And then China, Mahayana, as well as Korea and Japan. And Southeast Asia, brown, Theravada. So you may know that the Theravada Buddhism is also called the Hinayana, the small vehicle, and basically refers to Pali Buddhism, the kind of early original Buddhism that is based on a canon of texts in Pali, so not in Sanskrit. And Mahayana is the great vehicle, that also involves lay people and is mostly based on canon written in Sanskrit. And so also the Vajrayana, the esoteric part of the Mahayana, so to speak. So this Theravada Buddhism, as you can see, includes maritime Southeast Asia, that is Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., and even places like Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, which are today Theravada, but were not so in the past. And as far as I know, there is no evidence of Theravada Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia prior to basically to the early modern period. So again, this is a misconstruction. Similarly here, Theravada is in Thailand, Burma, and Laos, and Mahayana in East Asia, etc. Now, it's true that there were networks between Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia, Theravada networks, but they only started in the 12th, 13th century. Before the 13th century, what we now call Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, they were not Theravada at all. In fact, the prominent religion was Shaivism, and Buddhism was also found. It has retained a rather important role, but it was again the Mahayana or Vajrayana, kind of Buddhism. It was not yet Theravada. So this is a kind of anachronism that often, pervades still the common understanding of this region. And as before, you can see here also, maritime Southeast Asia is just completely left out of the picture. Now, this would be a map that more correctly represents the Buddhist centers and the important trade and political centers of the region, especially the connection between them by sea. And you can see that, as often is the case also in South Asia, there is an overlap between the political centers, important centers of trade, and also important centers of Buddhism, or at least places where Buddhism was found, where we have evidence, and especially of Sanskritic Buddhism. This map represents the social circles, again, of Tantric Buddhism. You can see that these prominent masters, again known thanks to historical documents, can be linked to multiple places in maritime Asia. And many of these monks were exceptionally well traveled. So we find indeed evidence of the travels from India to China and vice versa, via Southeast Asia, because many of these monks actually had to stay in Southeast Asia, either to change ship or to wait for the monsoon, for the right winds, or even to visit those islands that were also places where Buddhism flourished already. So they were not just crossroads, places where they waited for new ship, but they were places which they were wellsprings of Buddhist knowledge. And this is a very important fact that, again, has been passed over in silence by much of the past and recent scholarship as well. And so you can see in this map, let's say, how so many places actually had evidence of esoteric Buddhism and of maritime transfer and connectivity. Now, I think it is high time to elaborate a new narrative, trying to fit together all the pieces in this fascinating puzzle of the maritime spread and transfer of Sanskritic Buddhism. Because we have many data, so archaeology, textual studies, they really have developed a lot over the past 2 to 3 decades. So a lot of evidence is there, but because of the academic specializations, including myself, so academics tend to specialize in one area, in one region, in one, maximum 2 languages, especially old languages. And sometimes there is a tendency, this let's say, results in the perception of the evidence as fragmented, disconnected, and unrelated. I think it is high time to try to connect this disparate evidence and try to formulate answers to long debated issues. For instance, this geographically wide perception of the phenomenon can throw some light on the fascinating issue of the emergence of Tantric Buddhism. We are still not sure how exactly, Mahayana Buddhism developed within itself many Tantric currents around the 7th, 8th century. Okay, and if we only study India, we don't have enough evidence. I think we don't have much in terms of Buddhist archaeology texts, because much of this evidence has been preserved elsewhere, outside of India itself. And so maybe we can perceive this phenomenon as pan-Asian, or even as a Bay of Bengal co-creation. So there is no need to posit, let's say, a place of origin and then a linear spread towards the periphery, but it could rather be a co-creation. And this is something that is also increasingly clear from the study, for example, of Tantric Shaivism. There is also a tendency to, let's say, diminish, not give the right importance to South India and Sri Lanka with respect to this specific current of Buddhism. Of course, Sri Lanka is extremely important for Pali Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, and that is acknowledged, but not so for this other tradition within the Mahayana, that is the Tantric Buddhism. And the same can be said about Tamil Nadu. Now, we also have evidence, not much unfortunately, but definitely some evidence is there about the circulation of people, so Buddhist masters, icons, even texts, not just from the west to the east, but the other way around. So from Southeast Asia to India and the Himalayan region. Another important point, I think, that can be clarified by the study of this phenomenon is the issue of sponsorship. Okay, so far, maritime Buddhism has been rightfully connected to traders, okay, to traders who were able to sponsor monks and monastic institutions. They provided the ships to the monks to cross the sea. But another important dimension is the basically kings, so the royal dimension. And I see esoteric Buddhism as basically as an elite phenomenon, which, especially outside of India, didn't really penetrate the societies very deeply, but rather was limited to the courts, to the political elites and their immediate, elite social milieu. And this is evident, for example, whenever, some Buddhist king or Buddhist dynasty falls, then the religion almost disappears. So it is very much connected to the ruling elite. And it is important, I think, to start this new narrative from India, of course. I am not denying, as some scholars claim, that India didn't play any important role. I'm definitely not only highlighting the importance of Southeast Asia, but for me, it is important to study together, both South and Southeast Asia, and not only Southeast Asia per se, but especially the coastal areas. So if we study the kind of Buddhist documents, both visual and textual, from around the 7th century, we can see that the so-called savior cults started to develop around the period, especially indeed along the coasts of India. By savior cults, I mean the cults, the worship of bodhisattvas like Avalokiteshvara, Tara, and Mahapratisara, so both male and female deities, especially associated with travel by land, but especially by sea. And this we can see from from Western India, the caves of Kanheri, Ajanta, and Ellora. And in those caves are remarkably old, of course, and they also had Mahayana and Mantranaya, or let's say early Tantric phases. Okay, so it is in those places that we can see the first mandalic arrangements of such bodhisattvas. For instance, if before bodhisattvas were represented, you know, as in line, one next to the other, with the Buddha at the center. But from that period, the 7th century, they start to be represented in circles. The Buddha at the center, and then around, for instance, the great 8 bodhisattvas of the Mahayana. There is also a very important group of metallic statues from Sopara, also in Western India, Gujarat, which might be actually one of the, you know, kind of early, you know, mandala, portable mandala, but more study needs to be done. There is also another important dimension, that is the texts. So the early texts, let's say the properly tantric, the texts that we call the Yoga Tantras, the Buddhist Yoga Tantras, according to the later Tibetan, arrangement, basically. 2 texts in particular are the, you know, the most authoritative of this textual stratum. That is the Sarvatathagata Tattva Sangraha and the Mahavairochana Abhisambodhi. So these 2 texts in Sanskrit, especially in the case of the Sarvatathagata, so there is evidence pointing at a South Indian origin. And so this is important and kind of matches the evidence that we have about South India as a repository of texts, as even, I would say, a cradle of esoteric Buddhism, maybe even one of the regions where this phenomenon originated. Another overlooked area is the coast of the Konkan, so the southwestern Indian coast. And usually, well, we don't have many Buddhist remains, but we know from, for instance, colophons of manuscripts, of Buddhist manuscripts in Sanskrit, but also material evidence that there existed monastic centers, and many of the important masters of esoteric Buddhism were associated with these centers. Many, I would say at least some. We have rather credible evidence for at least a couple of them. And especially this place called Bimbakaya or Mahabimba. And it is also very interesting to mention the recent scholarship by Jim Mallinson on Hatha Yoga, and especially the origin of Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga is an eminently Hindu, I would say, phenomenon, but it seems that in origin, it was Buddhist, actually. So it originated in esoteric Buddhist circles, and then it was, let's say, incorporated or absorbed by Shaiva, ascetics. And it is also interesting to see nowadays in Mangalore, the Kadri Manjunatha temple, which is a Hindu temple with the mata, with also a monastery. Well, there are statues which are venerated as Hindu deities, but they are obviously Buddhist, and especially esoteric Buddhist. There are a bronze of Manjushri, for instance, a Buddha with features that are very similar to Sri Lankan or Tamil, maybe even Southeast Asian Buddhas. And all this suggests a maritime connectivity. We also know of individuals, as I said, important masters from Sri Lanka, like Jayabhadra, who copied Tantric Buddhist texts in locales in this coast, in the Konkan. And so again, this suggests the existence of maritime links. On the other side, on the Bay of Bengal coast of India, that is to say in Andhra Pradesh, we also have very important Buddhist centers. Of course, Amaravati, very ancient, with the Dhanyakataka stupa. And so we already have there an early center of Mahayana, basically. But again, there is the evidence not very clear, but nonetheless possible, about the fact that this could have been also one of the early, hotspots of Vajrayana Buddhism, especially the stupa of Danyakataka that seems to represent symbolically already the Buddhas placed in the cardinal directions. So the 4+1 Buddhas, which we find in the Vajradhatu Mandala. And of course, we know that Kanchi, Nagapattinam, Sri Shailam, these were very important religious centers, not only for Shaivism, but also for Buddhism. Nagapattinam, we know that we have an enormous collection of bronzes, of Buddhist bronzes. There were monasteries. There in Kanchi also, there were definitely Buddhist monasteries. So these two places in Tamil Nadu were, commercial entrepot. They were important political centers, centers of diplomacy, and Buddhism was a constant presence. And it is often, let's say, put as in second place because Tamil Nadu is such a strongly Shaiva, right? Strongly Hindu region that was Shaiva. The Pallavas, for example, the Cholas, right? But nonetheless, Buddhism was there, and it was important for the spread of Buddhism across the sea. Just briefly mention the Pallava religious diplomacy. For instance, the travel of an important esoteric masters like Vajrabuddhi and Amoghavajra from India to China via Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu. Okay, there is also another episode like the Nagapattina, a Buddhist pagoda was edified, was constructed by Narasimhavarman II in honor of the Tang emperor. So you see, in spite of the fact that we have Shaiva kings, there existed political and diplomatic links with other places, and these links included Buddhism. Another important place is Sri Lanka, as I mentioned. Sri Lanka is often linked to Theravada Buddhism, but that this is not correct. So we know that there is a rather significant archaeological, let's say, corpus, which shows Vajrayana character. For instance, there are images of Vajrasattva, Avalokiteshvara, and Tara. Especially also there are votive tablets with Mantranaya elements. And especially in the photo below, you can see this dharani, so these magical formulas engraved on slabs of stone. Engraved, by the way, not in Sinhala script, but in Siddhamatrika script. Siddhamatrika script is the script used in northeastern India, the script that was used in Nalanda, Vikramashila, and those important Buddhist centers. And so it was a foreign script, so to speak. And this again, suggests the existence of links that connected these faraway places by sea, of course. And these mantras actually contain fragments from, scriptures, early Tantric, we can say, of late Mahayana scriptures. And we know that especially important was the Abhayagiri Vihara. So this monastery, which was eclectic and included not only Theravada, but also Mahayana, and this, we can say, early Vajrayana, Mantranaya monks. Now, as I said, there is interesting also textual evidence that is a later chronicle, the Nikaya Sangrahaya, going back to the 14th century, actually mentioned Vajraparvata as a region inhabited by this Vajriyavada, so the Vajravada monks and the Nilapata Darshana monks, who introduced Tantric Buddhism in the 9th century, which was adopted by King Sena I. It is very intriguing that the 14th century text, in Sinhala language, mentions, basically gives us a list of Tantric texts, that is the Sarvatathagata, the Maya Jala, the Paramadhya, the Chakrasamvara, etc. And so this list actually really corresponds to the early library of esoteric Buddhism. So some very authoritative Sanskrit texts. And it is amazing that they have survived in this late scripture. And this evidence actually matches the historical evidence, for instance, drawn from Chinese chronicles, that tells us that many prominent masters, Vajrabuddhi, for example, or Amoghavajra, went to Sri Lanka to look for texts, so to look for Tantric scriptures that were not available in China or even in other parts of India. And they also look for initiations, for masters that could initiate them into this, let's say, systems that were gaining momentum. For instance, to be initiated by this Naga Buddhi, who is often traced back to some tantric connections, to some tantric corpora. So all this is very important, but yet we should not limit the scope of our study to South Asia alone, because we might miss the big picture. And scholars of Southeast Asia, and especially Southeast Asian Buddhism, like Peter Skilling, have already pointed out the importance, for instance, of Siam, so of modern day Thailand, for the Buddhist cultural interchange that unfolded during the medieval period. And so that they stress that India need not always be the center and Siam the periphery or a passive recipient of influence. Okay, but rather it's about the southern seas as sharing a wider Buddhist culture that stretched from all the way from Central Asia to East Asia. Another scholar, here Woodward, has advanced an argument even for treating Indonesia and India as an integral unit well into the 9th century, and even hypothesized that Borobudur, so the Buddhism represented at Borobudur, could have influenced later developments in South Asia itself. Arlo Griffiths was published a number of Sanskrit and Old Javanese inscriptions from Sumatra, Java, and Bali. Also knows that, unfortunately, this material, mainly Dharani, which bear clear traces of basically Mahayana and Mantranaya, has not been, let's say, developed much in the scholarship, especially the scholarship on Indian and Pan-Asian Buddhism. And this is a loss. This is a pity, because this material is important and relatively abundant. Suffice also to read some, of the best monographs on esoteric Buddhism, like that by Davidson, etc. Let's say the only available monographs on this phenomenon. They hardly refer to Southeast Asia. And even excellent entries of the best encyclopedias, the most recent encyclopedias of Buddhism, for example, the entries by Professor Kazuo Kano on the Sarvatathagata Tattva Sangraha and the Mahavarochana Abhisambodhi, they describe these mandalas like the Vajradhatu and the Garbhadhatu in India, East Asia, China, Japan, Tibet, but do not mention Southeast Asia, in spite of the fact that there exists a considerable body of evidence about these texts. Now, this is all the more true if we look at the Chinese evidence, so the chronicles or the travelogues, and this is an oft quoted, often referred to passage in I Ching, this monk, which was a late 7th century Mahayana, basically Sanskritic, monk from China who traveled to India to look for texts, basically texts in Sanskrit that he could translate or bring to India. And this is an important passage because, again, suggests that even though we don't have much, we cannot reconstruct these centers from what has survived in terms of archaeological remains. Of course, the climate, the rice fields, the water have basically destroyed much of what existed in the past. And yet, I Ching, tells the reader that there existed a really prominent center of Buddhist scholarship in Srivijaya, this maritime kingdom that probably covered the entire span of Sumatra and included parts of the Malay Peninsula and at some point maybe even West Java. And so en route from China to Nalanda, he actually suggests to his colleagues who would like to visit India, to stay for a while in Srivijaya, to practice the proper rules and learn, and then proceed to central India. So there were, we could say, Buddhist universities in that area. And these Buddhist universities, which have not survived, could be connected to the Buddhist universities we know from Eastern India, that is to say Nalanda, Vikramashila, Udandapura. So under the Pala rule, basically, and in this medieval period, these universities became magnets that attracted Buddhist scholars from all over Asia, basically, from all the regions where Buddhism existed. Okay, and basically there is this very important. So there is a very important inscription on a copper plate of Deva Pala Deva, probably the 9th century, which mentions Balaputra. Balaputra is a rather elusive character, but he seemed to have been a royal or princely character of Sumatra, so the Shailendra dynasty, which had, let's say, possessions also in Java. And Balaputra donates a monastery, and it seems one of the largest monasteries found at Nalanda, which was, let's say, there were many monasteries connected. It was a network of monasteries. And Balaputra donates the monastery for the students coming from Southeast Asia, from Sumatra, to study at Nalanda. And so this is striking, that it is not the Indian king who is mentioned in a Southeast Asian inscription donating something, but rather the other way around. A Southeast Asian king praised by the local king as a major donor, and contributor to this monastery. And this is interesting because, of course, it suggests clearly that there existed diplomatic links, very close diplomatic ties, and that the sea did not separate, but rather united these two regions. And there is also other evidence that we can add to this inscription. For example, another inscription slightly later, quoting a verse of the Bhadrachari or Bhadracharya Pranidhana, a text that became basically in transmission the last chapter of the Gandavyuha, a text which is represented lavishly in a very complete manner at Borobudur, and if I'm not mistaken, is one of the first, if not the very first, depiction in stone of this text. And this inscription is found at Nalanda. Again, the same monastery which was established by Balaputra Deva for the use of pilgrims from Srivijaya. And so this is the importance of the Bhadrachari Pranidhana might have been introduced from Sumatra, also because, let's say, it is very rare in India to find inscriptions quoting passages from Mahayana texts. This is actually one of the only known instances. And so could this idea perhaps have been borrowed from Southeast Asia rather than the other way around? This seems to be likely also because there is another inscription found in the Sambas Buddhist Hoard in Western Kalimantan, in what was Borneo basically, which again contain verses traceable to this early Mantranaya, late Mahayana text, like the Mahapratisara Mahavidyarajni, the Vajrachedika Prajnaparamita, etc. So there is again evidence of innovations, so to speak. And more interesting, the Bhadrachari has been linked to the monk Prajna, and Prajna was a very important in the esoteric triad formed by Amoghavajra, Vajrabodhi, and Prajna himself. So that the triad who introduced and popularized esoteric Buddhism in China. And Prajna himself actually translated these texts. And Prajna traveled to China via Southeast Asia. So in the chronology really matches with the chronology of Borobudur, which might have been built at the end, between the end of the 8th and the early 9th century. So it is not impossible that Prajna himself might have visited Java and might have been involved in some way and gave the inspiration, so to speak, to the artists and the architects to represent the Bhadrachari Gandavyuha at the monument. There are also other evidence. For example, there is a mantra of Amrita Kundalini, which is very much similar, you know, to the one transmitted by Prajna, so even the handwriting of Prajna that was transmitted to Japan. Now, we know about these links also from inscriptions from Java. Of course, there were masters, Buddhist monks, coming from the Pala domains to Java. For instance, again, this inscription issued by the Shailendra domains at Kelurak in central Java. And this inscription mentions Kumara Ghosha as a royal preceptor, so as a Raja Guru from Gaudi Dvipa, it is modern day Bengal. And this Raja Guru installed an image of Manju Ghosha or Manju Shri at the request of the king, Sangramadhananjaya. Another inscription, more or less going back to the same period, opens with a salutation to Tara, that is female goddess, and mentions the construction of a temple for Tara, which Roy Jordan identified with the temple now called Chandikalasan. Now, there are interesting similarities because in one line of this inscription, of the Plausan inscription, actually not far away from that, the wife of a royal figure is said to shine forth like Tara, Tareva Virajati. And the same similes, the same metaphor, and the same word Tareva occurs in the Nalanda copper plate of Devapala, which I have just discussed, okay, and linking Tara to the queen mother of Balaputra, so the Shailendra royal figure from Sumatra. So you see how really specific similarities can be found in the literary, we can say literary, cultural, religious culture of these two areas, quite far away from each other. And again, I stress the fact that these inscriptions are in Siddhamatrika script. They are not in the local Javanese script, descending from Southern Brahmi, but again in a, so to speak, foreign script and in Sanskrit language. And this points to the cosmopolitan character of the dynasty, of, let's say, the political culture of the time, that really wanted to anchor itself to this Buddhist, perhaps esoteric Buddhist, in any case, Sanskritic Buddhist, you know, culture. Okay, this I already mentioned. Yes, indeed. Okay, there is also another inscription, but more interestingly, even in Old Malay. So neither in Sanskrit or Old Javanese, but Malay, the language that was spoken in Sumatra, the domain of the Shailendras, that mentioned the Manjushri Griha, so the temple of Manjushri near Chandisewu in central Java, which mentioned Nayaka, a local name, Rangda Lurawang, who had a vision of the Bodhisattva at Vajrasana, and Vajrasana usually indicated Bodh Gaya. So this could be evidence of the fact that Southeast Asian also visited Bodh Gaya for pilgrimage, and definitely already in 9th century central Java. But there is also evidence, although not very clear, of pilgrims arriving from India to visit Javanese monuments, if Gurjara Desha indeed is a region of India, either Gujarat or the area of the Gurjara Pratihara in northern India. Okay, so actually here we have an example of pilgrimage from India to Java, and again, this inscription is also in Siddhamatrika and in Sanskrit. Other, you know, elements of connectivity are the inscriptions, same in Sanskrit and Siddhamatrika script, mentioning the Abhayagiri Vihara. The Abhayagiri Vihara, we have seen, was this monastery in Sri Lanka, which had elements, let's say, currents of Mahayana and Mantranaya. And so this inscription has been found in Ratu Boko, which is a prominence in central Java, not far from the temple complex of Prambanan and Chandisewu. And this is very intriguing that the Abhayagiri Vihara is mentioned in this place, and not only the inscription mentioning the Abhayagiri Vihara, but more evidence exists about similarities between Sri Lanka and, in this case, Ratu Boko in central Java. For instance, the so-called double platform meditation structures, which can only be found at Abhayagiri and at Ratu Boko in the entire Buddhist world. And intriguingly, there were various Abhayagiri. So there are toponyms known from ancient sources called Abhayagiri. So it is possible that that they might have been intended as references to this very important place in Sri Lanka. The fact that Java ranked high in the Buddhist geography of the time is also suggested by one of the biographies of Vajrabodhi, the Chinese biographies, that suggests that Amoghavajra, the pupil of Vajrabodhi, encountered his masters nowhere else than Java itself. And so both, let's say, both pupil and masters were in Java for some reason. Maybe they were, probably they were just transiting on their way to China or India, but maybe they were actually, they might have been invited, you know, by the rulers. They might have been there because they wanted to visit some places of pilgrimage. Okay, and this is very important, and such prominent Buddhist personalities were in Java in that period. And we also have evidence of a Javanese monk called Bian Hong, who studied in China under Hui Guo. Hui Guo is the disciple of Amoghavajra, another esoteric Buddhist master. And Bian Hong wrote a text in Sanskrit, which is only survives in the Chinese version, entitled Chakravarti Mahamandala Abhisheka Vidi. So it is an initiation manual, okay? And this reflects the interest of the royal elites. The kings were interested in being initiated in Buddhist rituals of initiation. And this is very clear from both the textual evidence and the art historical evidence, as we will see. And there is evidence again of other masters from India traveling to Southeast Asia. For instance, the famous Atisha, but I will talk about it later. For the time being, let me note that there was also a monk known in Chinese as Shihu, or Dhanapala, who was a native of the Swat Valley in Pakistan, who knew the languages of Srivijaya. So obviously, if he studied them, it means that there must have been Buddhist scriptures in those languages that must have been interesting to translate. And so he translated those scriptures, apparently. And all the way to the 16th century, there is a tradition of you know, Buddhist, let's say, Siddha, in this case called Buddha Guptanatha, who is recorded by his student, the famous Taranatha, the Tibetan Chronicle, to have traveled extensively throughout India and Southeast Asia, again, to looking for Buddhist vestiges, basically. And the existence of this kind of, you know, extended Buddhist geography in the 11th century is suggested by this Sahasrika Prajnaparamita manuscript from Bengal, which contains illustrations of interesting Buddhist places. Think about it as a guidebook, you know, a pre-modern guidebook, and it contains several images of places in Southeast Asia, not only in South Asia. For example, this Buddha Dipankara statue from Java, or the Lokanatha or Lokeshwara in Valavati. Valavati was a mountain probably located in Kedah, so on the Malay Peninsula. And much of this geography is maritime, really. It is very striking. And let me mention Atisha, this very important Buddhist masters, Vajrayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, who spent 12 years in Suvarnadvipa. Suvarnadvipa is identifiable with either Sumatra or the Malay Peninsula. And the reason why he spent time there is that he wanted to study with Dharmakirti from Suvarnadvipa, who was the Rajaguru of a Chola, probably installed by Chola, but we are not sure, a king called Chudamani Varman. So this is just a hypothesis. And so he embarked on a very difficult, you know, journey. We have a Tibetan biography describing this journey also in imaginific terms. To spend such a long time, because Dharmakirti was really one of the most prominent intellectuals and probably the only one who could teach some tantric texts that Atisha was inspired through a dream to study. He had a dream where Evajra actually ordered him to embark on this trip. And Atisha travels back to India, and especially to Tibet, after having visited Sumatra or the Malay Peninsula. And he even brings back texts by his master. And these texts only survive, some of these texts only survive in the Tibetan canon. For example, the sadhana on the Bodhisattva Achala or on Krodha Ganapati. So these are tantric sadhanas. And there is a striking example of periphery, let's say Southeast Asia, influencing Tibet and the Himalaya region via the maritime connection. And so this is a really striking example. Now, this again, the fact that Atisha traveled to Sumatra or the Malay Peninsula in that period, it's not just, you might cast doubt on that. You might say, well, this is just, some Tibetan chronicle that contains many imaginary elements. Okay, but there is also, material evidence. So we know from statuary, for example, and especially in inscriptions, that Sumatra, which was part of the same Buddhist culture as the Malay Peninsula, by the way, and even mainland Southeast Asia, in those precisely around that period, from the 11th to the 13th century, was a center of Buddhist Tantrism, and especially the cult of Evajra. Okay, so we have many dharanis, so many inscriptions containing portions from the Evajra Tantra. Again, this very striking habit in Southeast Asia of quoting portion of Sanskrit texts in these dharanis. And also below you see on the right a statue, unfortunately missing and much already damaged, of Evajra or Heruka, so this dancing antinomian, let's say transgressive esoteric Buddhist deity, which is very similar to the, we can say, prototypes on the left from Bengal. And these are the inscriptions published by Arlo Griffiths, and on gold foils, for example, again quoting parts of the Evajra Tantra. And by the way, the Evajra Tantra mentions Sumatra, Suvarnadvipa, so the Evajra Tantra knows the Buddhist, extended Buddhist geography, and Suvarnadvipa was part of it. If you look closely, carefully at the center, you will see this Vishwavajra, so the syllable hum, again in Nagari script, not in the local script, with these four, the prongs of the Vajra on the cardinal directions, the same, exactly the same, also on this gold plate, or again from Sumatra, containing this mantra of Evajra, and again another quotation clearly from the Evajra Tantra on a stone depicting the same Vishwavajra motif. We also have other accounts about the one of the founders of the Kalachakra tradition, that is called Kalachakrapada the Greater, or Pindo in Sanskrit. And according to the Tibetan chronicles, he was from Java, Javadvipa. Okay, so together with other Indian masters, probably Naropa and others, at the very beginning, middle to of the 11th century, the Kalachakra was created by a congress, let's say, during a conference of masters in northern India, perhaps. But again, it is this conference, was the result of a congregation of people coming from different parts of the Buddhist world, and one of the most important was coming from Java. And this fact is because we have no evidence really of Kalachakra in Java, which doesn't mean that it didn't exist. Simply, we do not have evidence that has survived, has tended to be, let's say, mentioned in the scholarship on the Kalachakra, but always like as a footnote, right? I think this should be the center of the narrative, the scholarly narrative of the Kalachakra, because the Kalachakra is a very strange text. It mentions Islam, for example. There are many elements that, look peripheral, so to speak. It might have been the result of a contribution of forms of Buddhism that were not the main forms of Buddhism that you could find in India. And so we really know that, I mean, the chronicles, again, which you might believe or not believe, but we have evidence also artistic, for example. So the chronicles tell us that there was a diaspora of monks from Eastern India and even the Himalayas to China and Southeast Asia. So we really have around the 12th century, 13th century, many Buddhist panditas, learned masters. They looked for sponsorship. They traveled all the way to Southeast Asia, for example, in East Java, under King Kartanagara, who was the arch enemy of Kublai Khan in China. Kublai Khan attempted, actually, he did invade Java with a powerful army and navy, and it was a catastrophe. Much of the navy was destroyed, and absolutely there was no military conquest at all. It was a catastrophe for the Mongols. But in any case, there is quite a lot of evidence that suggests a shared Buddhist culture between China and East Java, especially revolving around this, let's say, esoteric deities that were especially popular with monarchs because they were protective deities. They were state protectors. The Mongols, for instance, used Mahakala, the Buddhist Mahakala, on their banners. So the armies, were fighting under the protection of Mahakala, and temples to Mahakala were built in China. It was really the inner court favorite cult of Kublai himself. And the same seemed to have been the case in East Java. Now, we know that there were contacts besides this episode, which I mentioned of the invasion. There were diplomatic contacts, there were trade contacts. This was a very prosperous age. And there is also other evidence, for example, textile depicted on statues that suggests that certain motifs traveled from Central Asia, especially the Mongol-controlled Central Asia and China, to Java. And so besides that, there is also evidence about masters, as I said, traveling, okay? And one piece of evidence is this inscription, which is called the Karimun. So the Karimun Islands are not far from modern day, let's say between modern day Singapore and Palembang in Sumatra, not far from Singapore. There is a graffiti, this inscription mentioning Sri Gautama Shri, and we know about a Gautama Shri Bhadra, who was a Pandita, again a Buddhist intellectual from Bengal, who was active in Tibet, Nepal, and China exactly during the time, let's say that of Kartanagara and Kublai Khan. So we know that this Gautama Shri actually is identified in Tibetan lineage texts, and he was a tantric master. So he mastered the Kala Chakra, for example, and he taught this to Tibetan disciples. And these disciples, let's say, were part of the so-called Sakyapa tradition. And the Sakyapa tradition became prominent at the court of Kublai Khan. So what he's doing is Buddhist Pandita in Sumatra, probably traveling to China or maybe even to East Java, where Kartanagara, this mighty, very powerful king, very aggressive, also invaded part of Sumatra, and he was definitely initiated into the Evajra system, and he was sponsoring a kind of transgressive Buddhist iconography. For example, the statues are full of skulls, that again recall this cremation ground culture of the Yogini Tantras and also the Bhairava Tantras. There are images, statues of Bhairava, under his reign. So this king was definitely after this cosmopolitan, type of Buddhism. And we also have the existence of a Manjushri, which in East Java is basically unknown. Only during his reign, this majestic Manjushri, now at the Hermitage, is reproduced. And again, it really goes back to prototypes found in Nepal, in Mongolia. And these prototypes are part of mandalas where Manjushri is the, let's say, benign, manifestation of Vairochana. And Mahakala is the angry manifestation. All right, and so Manjushri and Mahakala are connected as let's say the bright and the dark side of the same supreme reality. And so it is absolutely possible that these icons traveled, and that Kirtanagara was inspired by artists from Tibet or Nepal, and we also have actually inscriptions in Nagari script, so probably by northeastern India or Nepalese artists. And I mean, this discussion is very complicated. I don't want to go into it, but just very briefly to mention this important statue, which is called Padang Rocho in Sumatra. This is a colossal statue, almost 4 meters high, nowadays found in Jakarta in the National Museum. And this statue was always identified as a Bhairava and connected with the Sumatran king Adityavarman. But there is not a shred of evidence connecting this statue with Adityavarman. On the contrary, all the stylistic features point to a time, let's say a period, the period of Kirtanagara in East Java. And Kirtanagara indeed sent to the same place, to Padang Rocho, the statue you can see on the right, which is an Amoga Pasha, Lokeshwara. He sent it by ship, and you can see it's almost 2,000 kilometers, of distance. But we find this statue and an inscription by Kirtanagara, and the statue was reconsecrated by Adityavarman. And so this colossal 4-meter statue might actually represent Mahakala. There is not really features that are compatible with the iconography of Bhairava. On the other hand, there is a small akshobhya on the mukuta, in the headdress of this figure, and it is the same iconographical, pose, let's say, with the hand handling this ritual dagger and the skull, which we find in this icon of Mahakala called Panjaranatha, which again was prominent in the Sakyapa, and it was prominent in the cult, in the royal cult that Kublai Khan adhered to in China. Okay, so I think this was all I wanted to share with you. There was more, but I have no more time. But I hope this was sufficient to, let's say, give you a glimpse of this very complex web of maritime context, and also the importance of study this phenomenon, esoteric Buddhism, Sanskritic Buddhism, from the point of view of, in a from a pan-Asian perspective, and from the point of view of maritime context. Keeping in mind that India was, let's say, a partner. It was not just the, let's say the origin, the point of origin of these cults, but was a partner in a much more wider geographical and cultural, discourse that unfolded throughout the medieval period. Thank you.
Thank you. That's quite a bit of material for many of us to process. Yeah. But it immediately brings up a whole range of questions. Right. The first is that if I can compare, let's say, just Shaivism, especially connecting it to yesterday's lecture, and what you have talked about of the spread of Buddhism and its strong, roots in many of the Southeast Asian countries, we see that Shaivism persisted here in India and is continuing to persist. Whereas elsewhere, Shaivism is like almost completely gone, with the exception of perhaps Java, a bit of it today. On the other hand, Buddhism, more or less simultaneously or perhaps a little later, spread, where it has taken a much stronger root in the, let's say, periphery, if I may call periphery, which is, we very clearly understand it is not, but has completely vanished from the core India. I mean, what are some of the key points? I know it's a huge topic, but I would like your take on that.
Yes, I mean, it's still a very much debated and open-ended, question. I mean, as I said before, I think that royals played an important role. I think that scholars have, for example, have actually hypothesized that Buddhism was a runner-up, that the first Tantric texts were Shaiva, so Shaivism was the first religion that started to have this kind of Tantric rituals, Tantric deities, and Buddhists, seeing that it became so popular so quickly, adopted by kings, they also tried to do the same things, basically the same rituals, and so Shaivism already had a strong base when esoteric Buddhism came to the fore. And of course, I mean, in the periphery, maybe, I really don't know, but perhaps in China, I mean, Japan, there are, of course, traces of Buddhism, we can say, it never became mainstream. In Java also, it disappeared after the 9th century and only survived in East Java as a kind of subordinate religion. And even in Bali, there are small communities of Buddhists in a Hindu island. I think it is, again, this suggests a connection with the royal milieu and the courts rather than the society at large. And the same happened in India, where there was not a very large social support, and rather Shaivism and Vaishnavism became the prominent religious forces, so to speak.
So in another key aspect is that the Sanskritic texts are traveling, Sanskritic tradition is traveling, but what I was curious about was, in the inscriptions that you talked about, the inscriptions are not following the local, by using Nagari or Siddhamatrika. Who were they trying to talk to? Even if it was only a mantra or a talisman which you just wear, which is not the case because there are some stone-based inscriptions as well. What was the purpose of using something which is very clearly not the local text? Local script. Any specific thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think precisely it is interesting to study these inscriptions from this point of view. It is difficult to say, of course, but there are some possibilities. Just to to mention one, is that the Pallavas, for instance, were known to have issued bilingual inscriptions in the in the Grantha script and Sanskrit, and in the Siddhamatrika script at the same time.
Okay.
Could it be some kind of diplomatic gestures towards the palace, which in the same period were very strong? Could it be an attempt to be cosmopolitan, to anchor themselves to the cosmopolitan Buddhist culture, which was dominated partly by these great universities? So again, who was the audience? We don't know. Maybe the intellectuals, maybe even people coming from India, or let's say from the same Buddhist culture of these monastic and universities. It is a possibility, of course.
Okay. There are a few questions from the audience. One from Sukanya, which is more a rumination, saying, what a transgression of a path taken by Buddhism. Is this what Gautama Buddha envisaged? I think she's talking about the core teaching of Buddha, if you can call it that way, and the early versions of aniconic worship, which then gives way to this whole profusion of deities and iconographies and forms of worship. Maybe you can comment on.
Indeed. Well, I mean, there is clearly an influence of Shaivism there.
Right.
So many of the elements that were found in, let's say, theistic Hindu traditions like Shaivism were incorporated in this text, and is inevitably, caused them to drift away from the original message of Buddhism. But if you look at Mahayana, it is also like that. I mean, it's some kind of, historical development, I would say, within the tradition, although there is the traditional view, the view that some of Mahayana practitioners and modern, let's say, Vajrayana practitioners have, is that actually the Buddha did teach that path already, but it was not for everybody. It was for a very small selected elite of those advanced enough to practice it. And so this might actually go back to the very message of the Buddha, according to the traditional.
A related question from Siddhartha Natarajan is, what were the aspects of Buddhism that made it such an attractive state religion to the polities of East and Southeast Asia? So much so that, it sort of won over everything else.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I mean, it's difficult to say, but one example, I think it was Amoghavajra when he went, to China and he became almost immediately so important at the Tang court because the emperor asked him to produce rain. They were interested in rituals, rain making. There was a drought. Then there was the daughter of the emperor was ill, and she was healed. So I think Buddhism tapped on that common knowledge, I think, of, we can call it tantric magic, that various religious currents were already, practicing. And so these rituals were perceived as powerful, effective, and Buddhist masters had no problem to even perform ritual to kill the enemies under the excuse to kill the enemies of the Dharma, So I think it is, again, some kind of pragmatic, mixed with maybe personal devotion, we don't know exactly, but it is something that it's definitely possible.
Well, in a sense, a certain form of magic or miracles made that shift in Tamil Nadu from the Jainism to, Saivism, both in the case of the Pallavas and the Pandyas in the somewhere around the 5th century, 6th century period, right? So you're saying it could be the reverse of that with the state, the king really taken up by what the Buddhist Mahayanic monks could do, which probably must have pushed him. No, that's certainly a possibility. Now, related to that is a question from Studio PP. I don't know exactly what his name is. He's there every day, but I can't get his name. Please type your name. He says, even after Hinduism or Shaivism was replaced by Buddhism, how is it that a lot of Brahmanism remained, especially in Thailand, such as the Thai king's advisors or Brahmins? Any response to that?
Yes, it is true. I mean, with respect to the Thai Brahmins, I'm not sure if there is a continuity because we know that they went back to lineages in the 17th, 18th century. But even if there was, there were definitely Brahmins at the court of even the Cambodian kings, and so it's true. So Brahmanism, according to Bronkhorst, this Indologist from the Netherlands, Johannes Bronkhorst, Brahmanism is not a religion; it's a social system. And also Alexis Sanderson has studied Shaivism and Buddhism in Cambodia and Brahmanism. So Brahmanism was adopted as a subsidiary system. Even the Buddhists at some point perhaps adhere to the class system, described by Brahmins. So I think there is no contradictions there. The Brahmins were ritual specialists. So kings were eclectic. The more, the better. Many kings, welcome Brahmins, Buddhist Shaivas, as long as they could carry out the court rituals. And Brahmins were the specialists in rituals. And this was very clear. And it is still there in modern Thailand. We can see the royal coronations, for example.
Okay. And Jainas as well do have a priestly class and do have a sense of Brahmin and other split as well. So I guess, that's something. So Studio PP says his name is Pratyush Prasad. There's a question from Ishan Harid. He says, thank you for the enlightening lecture. At the core of your study, the economic relationship between these two regions, namely the, I think Indian and the Southeast Asian regions. What role do you think the monasteries played in trade and craft?
I am not sure. I don't think they played, a big role. Monastics were sponsored by traders, for sure, by kings. So I think it's monastics, monks use the traders' ships to travel. So I think it was a kind of parallel. They just proceeded on a parallel ways, and maybe helping each other in some way. The monasteries, of course, provided the kind of ritual and spiritual needs of the community, and on the other hand, the community, funded, let's say, sponsored them.
In terms of the early Chinese travelers who came from China to study, understand Buddhism, and also translate a lot of works. At a later point in time, when the Mahayana, the Tantric Buddhism spread, do we have clearly such documented scholars who came from different parts of the Southeast Asia to India to study, or even not necessarily to India, but other places that had the spread of for example, like going to Tibet, perhaps, even though the Ceylonese Buddhism is different, to go there and study. Do we have such names, such as what we keep repeatedly talking about in India of a Fahia or Yuan Swang, or names like that? Yes. Do we have that kind of a very well-detailed names, biographies, etc.?
Unfortunately not. But this is not to say that there was none. We have, for example, the name which I mentioned in the talk, Bian Hong, who was a Javanese and went to study to China under the famous pupil of Amoghavajra, Guiguo, and came back perhaps, but he wrote a text, an initiation text, So we have scattered evidence. We have Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa, who attracted people from India, So again, the historical record is very fragmentary, but it makes sense given the existence of these large Buddhist centers, the Borobudur, in Java, Candi Sewu, these enormous, Buddhist complexes. There must have been students, Buddhist scholars, and some of these Buddhist scholars definitely traveled. So I think it is possible, but I wish the Chinese sources were more detailed in this respect.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And one final question from Ramji says, Maldives, not considered by you in your presentation, they seem to have had an incredible Buddhist past. Most of the islands, atolls are even now referred to as Bodu, but much of the evidence has been erased. But Divehi, their national language, is significantly old Sanskrit based. Considering this, any idea about the school or vehicle of Buddhism that was prevalent there, and if there is any history of the same?
Yeah, indeed, yes. I actually do mention in my articles, not today, but it's a very important remark. There is evidence of Buddhism, and the only evidence of Buddhism is Tantric, let's say, is Dharani. If I'm not mistaken, there are two Dharanese, inscriptions, and even a face of, resembles Kala, like this Kala head that you find in Java, So there is evidence of Tantric Buddhism, even in the Maldives. Maybe, monks traveled even the other way and stopped, and now we have these interesting vestiges.
But that never got to Sri Lanka. Right? The strong.
It did. Not strong. It didn't become mainstream. It is one of the losers, let's say. The winners were the Theravadis, but it is. The Abhayagiri Vihara was in Sri Lanka, and we have definitely Vajrayana vestiges, and Sri Lanka was an important place for esoteric Buddhism. There is no doubt about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we have come to the 7 o'clock time where we have to switch to the second talk. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I'd like to invite Kishore to thank you and then introduce the next speaker. Over to you, Kishore.
Thank you, Dr. Andrea Acri, and thank you for that lecture. With that, we go to our second talk for the day, and we would like to introduce the speaker, Dr. Rila Mukherjee. Rila Mukherjee, PhD Social Sciences from Paris, 1985. She is the author of India in the Indian Ocean World. She retired from the University of Hyderabad as a professor in history in October 2022. Apart from English and French, she is fluent in Bengali, Hindi, Portuguese, and Spanish. Since 2015, she has been the chief editor of Brill Journal, Asian Review of World Histories. She's been a visiting professor in Paris, Shanghai, Kolkata, Shantiniketan, and Uppsala, visiting scholar in Tokyo, Berlin, and Madrid, and project reviewer for the European Science Foundation, the Slovenian Research Agency, and the Danish Humanities Research Council. She partnered the European Science Foundation project on dynamic cooperative networks, the ANR project, the Murdoch University project on history and natural hazards. Mukherjee's recent edited publications include Order, Disorder in Asia, Indian Ocean Histories, the Mini Worlds of Michael Naylor Pearson, From Mountain Fastness to Coastal Kingdoms, Hard Money and Cashless Economies in the Medieval Bay of Bengal World, and Cross-Cultural Networking in the Eastern Indian Ocean Realm. She is currently under contract with Springer Global Publishing to work on a book on global history, provisionally titled Europe in the World 1350 to 1650. Dr. Rila Mukherjee, in her talk, The Maritime Worlds of East Coast India, will focus on the nature of maritime circulations from the coastlines of Bengal, Odisha, and Andhra, examining the lesser-known networks that are operating in these regions. Welcome, Dr. Mukherjee.
Thank you. Can you, am I seen?
Yes.
Right. Okay, so thank you for this introduction. Very nice. Thank you, Kishore. I think I'll start sharing my slides now.
Yeah.
Now, just let me know, Mr. Shishadri or Mr. Mahadevan, if the slides can be seen, because it's slightly problematic anyway.
If you need any help, we can step in. So just go ahead and share. And
I am having problems. Oh dear. Yeah, wait. Oh dear, no.
no problem.
I'm
think,
just giving
you are,
I need to get to my screen, or let me see if I can do it this way. Am I seen here?
Yeah, we can see you. Just
Can you see my slides?
No, I can't see your slides yet. You'll have to share screen.
Yeah, I am sharing the screen. And actually, the problem is I'm on a Mac, and Mac has somehow just updated. Give me a second.
Or have you sent your presentation to?
I was not asked to. I wish I'd known, because then I would have done that.
That's okay. What exactly is the, Mac is something I'm very familiar with. I'm also sitting on a Mac.
Oh,
Just
good. You see, the moment I do my share screen, I'm getting the Mac whiteboard, which says desktop 1 and then whiteboard.
That's fine. But are you seeing your presentation as one of the windows?
No, that's the whole issue. I mean, when I did a trial run with Share, okay, I could get onto it, but
no problem. You select desktop itself.
I select what?
The desktop, the first.
Yeah, well, I'm not being able to do that. That's the whole problem. I'm getting signed into your contacts, calendars. I'm not getting, this is what I was very worried about. I'm getting security and privacy. This is the annoying thing.
Okay. If it's possible.
I've got desktop.
Okay.
And I've got, okay, let me get onto files. No, I've got onto.
That will not help you. You have to first share your screen.
Yes, I have put share my desktop, then allow Zoom to share your screen. And then I'm opening the preferences, but I'm getting security and privacy.
But that's okay. No problem. Please go there.
Okay.
On the security and privacy.
Yeah, I'm there.
So there, 1 second, I will take privacy and security. You will see what else you see on the screen.
It's not there. It's not there. It's not in security and privacy. This is the whole problem. Share screen. Sorry, I mean,
Oh, that's fine. Is there, can you
yeah, tell me.
the presentation to me now, or how big is your presentation?
Do you want me to just send it to you?
Yeah, I will give you my email in the chat window.
Don't do that. But I'm really surprised because
That's okay. Don't worry. I mean, just take some
Sham.
and we'll fix that.
Okay.
I've just shared my email address.
Do one thing. Just send it to rila.mukherjee@gmail.com. I'm leaving the Zoom window now. Oh, it's come on chat, right?
You can stay here. Don't you don't need to.
Sheshadri.
@gmail.com.
Okay, hang on.
No, don't worry about that. It's okay. Just 1 or 2 minutes and we should be ready.
Okay, just spell it out for me once again. SESHADRI. B Seshadri.
Right.
Gmail.com, right?
Right.
Okay, this is coming to you as a PowerPoint.
That's okay. I'll take care of it. No problems. Within a minute, we should be fine.
It says RM THT PPTX.
Yeah. I'll wait for a second.
Okay. It's being sent as a Google Drive link.
I'll take it. No issues at all. Just give me a minute.
No, it's still catching.
Okay.
It's a Google Drive link, so it takes a bit of time.
Viewers, just wait for a minute or two maximum, and we should get going.
Yeah, I will be in front of the screen. I'm sitting in front of my screen.
That's okay. Take your time. I mean, just 1 or 2 minutes is not an issue.
Are you streaming this to the audience or not?
Yeah, that's okay. Audience are seeing it, but it's okay. No problems.
Okay, it's coming to you, right? It's coming to you, RMTHT PPTX.
1 second.
It's gone.
Yeah.
It's gone to you.
Just a minute.
I'm there. You just tell me whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I've gotten it.
Okay, so why don't you open it?
We will start.
And I'll just keep saying next slide, when I'm over.
That's enough, and I will take care of that.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Mr. Sheshadri.
No problem. Sometimes these things happen and we have to be just prepared for that. We just need a plan B and we are.
No, the problem always is, Zoom keeps updating.
Okay. I've gotten it. I'm just loading it. Just give me a second and we'll.
It'll take a bit of time to open because it's very heavy on visual.
It's a huge file. Yeah, it's coming.
Because Sham said that, they're not all historians. So
Yeah.
in mind.
Images certainly help. Yeah. They are. 1 second, I'm just getting ready. All right. We have it. I'll just share it. Do you have any audio clip in it?
No, I thought I would just present and.
That's okay. That's fine. Fine. I just wanted to confirm whether we have any.
Do you want to go full screen or?
Yeah, I'm going full screen and I will just stop my video. And yeah, there you are. And
wonderful. So shall I start off?
Yes, you can start.
Okay, so good evening, viewers and listeners. It's an honor to be asked by the Tamil Heritage Foundation to speak in their week on Maritime India. And I was asked to speak on East Coast India. Initially, I was asked to speak on the Bengal and Odisha coast, but I thought I'd bring in a bit of the Andhra coast because I knew the Chola coast would be covered. So the Andhra coast has not been so much studied. So I thought I'd put in a what I know about the Andhra coast as well. Am I audible?
Yes,
Wonderful. Next
I
slide.
think it's
please.
fine. Yeah.
Right. So today, what I've done here, you will see, is I have somewhat modified the concept note, which was sent by the THT Sagara Sangamam. And here I will not just look at port towns and port cities, but I'll be looking at coastal settlements and their connections. I'd like to study how far the reach of these coastal settlements go. And so my span will be as per also the concept note of the THT East Africa, but here I'll be specifically referencing Aden to Temasek, which is the forerunner of modern Singapore, and Malacca, of course, which the concept note had already spoken about. So we are essentially going to be talking about the whole span, if you like, of the Indian Ocean from west, that is the East Africa coast, up to Singapore. I am not in my presentation going up to China. There is a lot of data, but I thought I need to stop somewhere. I will also, when I look at the Bengal, Odisha, and Andhra coasts, try to see what makes their maritime circulation somewhat different from the circulations in peninsular India, especially the Chola coast. By the Chola coast, I mean Pallava, Chola, Pandya, and later the Malvar coast as well, what is popularly known as the Coromandel coast. And finally, I would like to end with looking at what is common and what is different in the maritime circulations of Bengal, Bihar, and the Andhra coasts. So next slide, please. Now, what I'm trying to do here is, when we normally look at maritime India, or we look at maritime India's connections, or we look at maritime India's circulations, we tend to look at trade. And so we tend to look at objects as commodities, as trade commodities. But, that is only one side, or the top level, the surface of the picture of circulations. So I am trying to go beyond trade, and I'm arguing that specifically in this presentation. So I'm not just looking at traders and trade goods, but I'm looking at pilgrims, scholars. Remember, this is a Buddhist world also, certainly as far as the Eastern Indian Ocean is concerned. Pilgrims, scholars, warriors. Warriors are very important, and I will show later why warriors are so important. And artisans, who pass through India's very many port towns and who have left traces of these passings. Sometimes we find them in archaeological artifacts. They don't always come up in epigraphical or textual or numismatic references. And we will also look at some of the objects that they left behind, which were not just commodities for trade, but maybe could well have been objects of everyday use. So if we could just go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so a lot of the data that I'm going to be using is from my book, India in the Indian Ocean World. And some of the maps that I'll be showing, the modern maps, are also from my book. So they're my copyright. So I did not need to acknowledge the sources there. Where I've used other maps, I have, of course, acknowledged the sources. Now, on the right-hand side, you will see a ceramic shard. It's just a fragment of pottery, which we recovered. I personally was there from a site in Eastern India, in Bengal, called Midnapore, British Midnapore, which is on the border of Bengal and Orissa. And on the left-hand side, you will see on the top, these are cowries, then silver coins. And on the right-hand side is a frieze of a panel from Konarak, the Sun Temple, with, if you can make out, a giraffe in the right-hand corner. Now, let me explain these images. When we look at this ceramic shard, for example, we are not talking about a good or an object, a trading object of very high value. We are talking about an object of everyday use. What is very interesting of this particular ceramic shard, and also some shards that I'll be showing you later, also from the Midnapore coast, is that the same kind of shards have been found on the northern part of Sumatra in Indonesia. Edwards McKinnon, who excavates there, sent me some of the pictures from there, which match perfectly with the shards that we found in Midnapore. And an archaeologist colleague who works on the Andhra coast told me that these are also very similar to the ceramic shards that are found in certain coastal spots in Andhra. So what does this mean? We are not talking about a trade. These are not high value ceramics, but we are talking of a kind of a shared culture of people who maybe migrated, came there. These were most of them cooking vessels, which the fragments of which have been left behind because they were settlements. And they were obviously probably not settlements of traders because the traders moved to the towns or the port cities, but they might have been settlements of either migrants or artisans, which is one category of migrants, moving between the two shores of the Bay of Bengal from the India side to Southeast Asia. Down below on the left, we found cowries. The cowries again are very interesting because we must not think that the whole of India was totally monetized. Cowries, the cowrie zone stretches all the way from East Africa to southern China. In some areas in China, today in China, such as Yunnan, which was very rich, if you read Marco Polo, in silver, they preferred to use cowries. Cowries were very common in daily usage in Orissa and Bengal. The Aini Akbari references cowrie use in Orissa. And as late as the 19th century in the British records for Bengal, we find everyday usage is undertaken in cowries. In fact, the term kodi is still used in Bengali literature and songs. And the cowries are still used. It's a symbol of passing also with a dead body in funerary practices. But that is not to suggest that the Bengal coast, for example, was short of coinage, because down here, just below the cowries, you will see the front and the back of verse, as we say, of a silver coin known as the Harikela coin, dating from about the 8th, 9th century. And this was used in trade across the northern Bay of Bengal, stretching into Burma and going as far as the Khmer domains, because we know that the Arakan coast and also the Khmer domains minted coins with the same symbols. You will find the bull at the top and the Trishula at the bottom. The last slide on the right is the Konark slide with the giraffe. Now, this is rather interesting. And two scholars in two separate works, Theobaldo Filesi and then later Sally Church, have studied this giraffe, which was apparently sent by the Sultan of Aden to Bengal. It came on an Arab ship. It must have made landfall in Orissa. Remember that, we are not talking of long distance non-stop sailing, all the sailings are stopping at various points on the coast to pick up goods and to sell goods. And for some reason, the giraffe captures the temple builders' imagination in Orissa. It is shown in this frieze in Konark, but the giraffe ultimately reaches Bengal. We are talking about the 14th century here, and is sent on to China. Now, this giraffe is not a trade item. It's a diplomatic gift. There's a great diplomatic gift and circulation of animals across the Indian Ocean. Exotic animals, giraffes, elephants, various kinds of tigers and lions are sent as gifts to those monarchs who don't have access to these animals. And these rulers keep these animals in their royal menageries. The suggestion is that the ruler does not just rule the earthly domain, that is people, but also has control over the natural world, here exemplified by the animals. So, we are looking at four kinds of interactions here. With the ceramic shards, we are talking about everyday life. With the cowries, we are talking about exchange, not based on money, but on an object which is relatively of low value. Incidentally, the cowrie shells come from the Maldives in this case, because I heard Mr. Shishadri ask Andrea about the Maldives. So there was a very enduring Maldives, Bengal, Orissa link. Surprisingly, the Maldives did not have much rice, and it's opposite the Kerala coast. But the Malabar coast is also quite deficient in rice production. So the rice used to come from Bengal and Orissa. And in return, they would take back these boats heaped with cowries. Various European travelers attest to this trade, and it goes on at least, we know, till the 18th century. So that's the second type of circulation. Third type of circulation is the circulation we are all familiar with, that is coin as the medium of exchange. And the fourth is the circulation of diplomatic gifts, seen in the circulation of animals across the Indian Ocean. Next slide, please. So, my question is that, are we going to be looking at the Eastern Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, the world from the Bengal, Orissa, Andhra coast as a world of sacred exchanges? I'm not arguing either way, but I'm leaving this question up to the audience. There are two maps on the left. The first, is ports in India. I don't know if you can follow the cursor. Ports in India in the ancient period. This is from my book. And, when we study history, if you look at our history books, we do a very land-oriented history. It's always a capital city-centric history that we are familiar with. So this is an alternate history, when we do maritime history, we are actually looking at the coast from the sea. And if you look at the coast, the India coastline from the sea, you will be seeing a plethora of port towns. But one thing I do want to point out here in this particular map is, more port towns in peninsular India and also in the Gujarat coast. The Gujarat coast is heavily commercialized. But, Orissa and Bengal, if you see, are fewer port towns. And I will come back to this point later. The other map is again a map of the ancient period, the Indian Ocean in the ancient period. And here, again, you will see that we have more of the port towns on the, the Red Sea, Persian Gulf side, linking to West Coast India. West Coast India, for whatever reason, I think saw commerce from probably a much earlier period, as far as the texts tell us. Whereas here, we find more Buddhist influences and the influence of China. This is very, very important. And the Indian texts really don't tell us much about circulations from East Coast India. I'm sure you have the Sangam text and all that, but not systematically. We cannot really see the kind of circulations, century by century, how they're progressing or regressing. But the Chinese texts have left us a lot of documentation. And then once, of course, we talk about Buddhist circulation, Southeast Asia becomes very focal. And so here, these are clay icons of the Buddha, which have been found. I mean, I took this photograph myself. And, the pews were a very important city-built civilization in the 8th century in this area. And this is one of the capital cities called Sri Kshetra. Sri Kshetra, again, it's a term we are familiar with. And these were found in a go down when I visited, I think in 2013, 10 years ago. And so, again in Midnapur, this place where, we found the ceramic shards, we found, these kalasas, which of course, are an item of exchange because, these jars would travel with commodities or with coins. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So, my question here is that are we going to be talking about a world of limited coastal exchanges? Or are we going to be talking about one of long distance trade when we're looking at circulations from East Coast India? And I'm going to be showing you some pictures of river craft, of boats. This is from Orissa. The shipbuilding technology, we have mainly river boats versus maritime or larger ships, which are capable of crossing the Bay of Bengal. And later we will see that most of the circulations along East Coast India, other than the Cholas, who go across to Srivijaya, as you all know, that is Southeast Asia, were actually coastal, going all the way down to Sri Lanka. So if you could look at the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to be talking so much, but sharing some pictures with you. On the left is a boat relief from Jagannath Temple. On the right, you will see, it's a place called Sribati, where I went. It's in Burdwan district in Bengal. Late 18th century, roughly 1770s. It's a cluster of temples owned by a family. The family now lives in Calcutta. But if you look at these friezes, these of these craft, the question is it a maritime world, a ritual world, as we can see from the left-hand image, or a world of leisure? Because if you look at the panel from Sribati, these are Europeans, and they seem to be really enjoying themselves on various kinds of boats. Let's move on. Next slide, please. Okay, now here is from a different area. This is just north of Calcutta. It's called Hooghly district. And this is the Ananta Basudev temple there. It is dated. There's a controversy about the date. I am giving you the dates so that you roughly can identify the periods when they were built. Either 1649 or 1679, we are not very sure. Now, this is a picture of the Jamuna crossing from the Krishna Lila. And again, it's religious, but people essentially enjoying themselves, but it's a river craft. It is not really a maritime ship crossing. Could we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, same thing here, not from the Krishna Lila. This is from Bishnupur, another area, still in Bengal, but to the extreme northwest above Burdwan, above the Sribati temple cluster that I showed. And again, it shows a group of female entertainers. They're all women here on a river craft. Next slide, please. But, I've been talking about leisure, or the world of leisure, river crafts, people singing, dancing, female entertainers, so on and so forth. But, it's also quite a violent world if you look at the iconography on the temples. On the left-hand side, is a panel. It's sculpted in terracotta, very popular in the 18th century in Bengal, of a woman of closed shutters. Closed shutters already implies, that you're closing yourself off from the outside world, but of a woman peering out. On the middle picture, the middle image is of a Portuguese warrior from Hooghly. In Hooghly. The image is in Hooghly. Remember, this is dated again 18th century, so the presence of the early Europeans is very much felt. And the right-hand one, the panel is very, very interesting. It shows a lion devouring a man, and the man seems to be dressed primarily in European clothing. If you could have the next slide, please. I think we skipped a slide. Yeah, okay. Now, when I take pictures, it's also nice to show where the panels are coming from. So here on the left is the Sribati complex. And if you look at the left, you can look at the wall. These are the kind of panels, that I'm talking about, this particular panel. And this is the Sribati temple complex seen from the front. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, a bit more violence. And this is Bishnupur. Remember, we saw the female entertainers, not the Krishna Lila, but the slide after that, those musicians. Same panel, same temple. It's called the Jor Bangla temple in Bishnupur, Northwest Bengal. And this is a picture of Portuguese gunners. It's not a picture. It's a terracotta image of Portuguese gunners, but it's a riverine craft still. So let's move on. So, why these pictures of violence? in rural areas, temples of terracotta temples of Bengal in the 17th and particularly in the 18th century. And that's because, the people are starting to internalize the tremendous violence, with slave trading that the Portuguese undertook in Bengal. The Portuguese were very famous, they linked up, they were called the Mugs. They linked up with the Arakanese. There are two terms for the Portuguese in Bengal. One is Harmat, which is Armada, and the other is Mugs, that they linked up with the people of Arakan and conducted slave raids into Bengal. Now, if you look at the left, this is a slave ship from Radha Govindo Temple, and again, late 18th century in Hooghly. And of course, in Pondicherry, we had Jean Deloche, who died, I think, just pre-COVID, was it? Or maybe Corona. And he did the temples, a particular temple in Tamil Nadu, Tirupudai Marudur. And here, he looked at the paintings and carvings. Here, on your left, the Artput temple, this is also from an article by Jean Deloche, is a slave ship, but again, it's a terracotta carving. And this is supposed to represent the heads of the people, the slaves kept in the hold. But on the right-hand side, in the Tirupudi Marudur temple, this is a Persian slave ship. Interestingly, it is essentially a horse ship. Remember, horses are very important to the Deccan and South India as a whole. So the Persian traders are bringing in horses. And down below is the heads of various slaves, because, all the ships that we have, pre-modern, if I may use a term, are multi-use ships. A warship, nothing called a war galley as such. It can double as a transport ship or as a passenger ship. And so you see the contrasting styles. The Persian one, of course, is much, much more nuanced because it's the painting. You have colors there. The left-hand side, the Bengal temple is terracotta, but still you can make out, the militant nature of the sculpture about this ship. Next slide, please. So I am now going to move on to, the separate course, having given this general overview. Before going on to the text on the left-hand side, I would like to focus your attention on this section of the globe, which shows the voyages of a Chinese admiral in the Ming period called Cheng He. He's also known in the history books as Cheng Ho, but the Chinese now refer to him as Cheng He. And he's from 1405 to 1433. He makes a number of voyages all the way from China across India, going up to the East Africa coast. Now, the main lines, I think he makes a total of 7 voyages. Now, the main voyages are marked in thick black ink here. And these are the feeder routes going up to Bengal, So the Bengal coast is not really important enough for Cheng He to come personally. But, once they come into this, the tip of Sumatra, a place called Samudra, one section of the convoy branches off and goes off to Bengal and to, the Coromandel coast. And this one would continue up to Malabar, the Kerala coast, and then up to East Africa. You see, the Malabar coast is always more important to the Chinese because they want to reach East Africa. And they were convinced that the Malabari sailors knew the East Africa route. So the East Coast India was not, it was a kind of a subsidiary stop for them. So to come back to the Bengal coast, there are certain specifications or distinctions of the Bengal coast that I would like to point out. Firstly, it's a funnel-shaped coast, right up at the tip of the northern Bay of Bengal. It's called, my Sanskrit is not very good, Assamudra Himachala, from the mountains to the sea unit in the Bay of Bengal and in the Eastern Indian Ocean. What it means is, you have essentially fewer maritime sailings and more upland, overland crossings across the mountains. I will talk about that. We do have coastal sailings from Bengal to Southeast Asia, but essentially, through coastal and to Sri Lanka. But what is very, very important in the case of Bengal is Bengal links to Yunnan and Southwest China, Sichuan, Yunnan, Guizhou by land. In the 7th century, you have the very famous China, Persia, Sasanian Persia trade, silk, slaves, eunuchs, mainly Bengal was very well known for eunuchs, and aloes. Aloes, of course, an item of great veneration. And we know that this passes through a region of Bengal called Samatata, which roughly can be equated with modern West Bengal. You do understand when I speak of Bengal, I'm referring Bangladesh as well. And we know this because of the similarity in the kind of coins minted in Bengal and Nepal and Tibet at this time. And these are gold coins, which actually means that this trade was quite profitable. However, this trade is mainly overland. There is much less sailing from the Bengal coast because historically it was a cyclone-prone coast. Historically, if you look at the historical records, the Bay of Bengal supposedly had historically more cyclones than the Arabian Sea, historically referenced. But now, of course, with global warming, the situation has changed because the Arabian Sea also witnesses very frequent cyclones. What we do know from texts and epigraphical evidence, it is kind of neglected in the long distance maritime routes. Here, the peninsular India is much more important. If you're coming from West Asia all the way to China, you touch the tip of India to move on. You don't really go up the Chola coast into the Bengal or Andhra coasts. And so until the 9th, 10th centuries, it is reasonably neglected. And why am I talking about the 9th, 10th centuries? Because that's when, we have the accounts of the Arab merchant Suleiman. We get references to Persian Arab traders settling in the area around Chittagong. So we know there is a small cluster of people coming to trade at Bengal. The Bengal coast, I would really argue, is a marginal economic in terms of trading. It's a marginal commercial area until the coming of the Bengal Sultanate in the early 13th century. And then, the mint is established and you have a systematic coin minting, silver coin minting starts. And the coinage provides us a clue as to the circulations from the Bengal coast thereafter. But there is one particular enigma about the Bengal coast, and I would like to just talk about this quickly, is if you look at the Portuguese diarist, Tome Pires, and he wrote, his diary was later on in 1944, printed from the Hautes Society in the UK as the Diary of Tome Pires. It's called Summa Oriental, and he writes it around, I think, 1514 or 1516. Now, 1511 was a very important date because that's when the Portuguese conquered the port city of Malacca. In the history of the Indian Ocean, 1511 is a very important date, which is the Portuguese conquest of the port city of Malacca. And after that, Tome Pires bases himself at Malacca and collects info about circulations around the Eastern Indian Ocean. And he, in fact, makes this very famous statement, whoever controls Malacca has his hands on the throat of Venice. What does he mean by that? That whoever controls the trade from Malacca was a great emporium of China, India traders. So whoever controls the trade from Malacca, mainly the trade in pepper, which is an item much in demand in Europe, has his hands on the throat of Venice, because Venice at that time in Italy was the center of the pepper trade in the 15th century. So Tome Pires says that there's something very strange about Bengal. He makes very, very nasty statements about Bengal, about the Bengal merchants. He says it's a very rich province, but there is a very low sense of business ethics. They're all cheats. And there are no local Bengali merchants. The term Bengali merchants that you come across, Tome Pires says, are actually not Bengali. They're Bengal-based merchants, but they're foreigners. They're Turks, Rumis, that is Byzantine Empire, Gujaratis, Persian, Arabs, so on and so on, and later on, of course, Portuguese and other Europeans. I have not really explained this slide below. It's an atlas. It's an anonymous Portuguese atlas dating from 1630. And it was produced anonymously, as I said, by a mapmaker for a Portuguese nobleman, Dom Jeronimo de Andrade. But what I find very interesting about this, it sums up the entire Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, the portion of Southeast Asia the parchment was folded. So you see, it's degraded here. You can't really read. But the ports and the capital towns are marked separately in black and red ink. So this is very interesting for us, because very often in history we get names, but those cities no longer exist. So it's very hard for us to locate them. And this atlas makes it very easy to locate many of the lost cities of the Indian Ocean. And so I included this here. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so now we come to the Orissa coast. Now the Orissa coast is really a very, very enigmatic coast. Okay, we are talking, of this portion, Odisha, Kalinga. This would be Utkal, I suppose, also. This is Vangadesam. We've done that. Story's over. So Orissa, well placed, to trade with Southeast Asia, practically bang opposite. But surprisingly, even less than Bengal, we have even less epigraphical and numismatic evidence. When we try to reconstruct the history, not just maritime history, but general history of pre-18th century, let's say, pre-17th, because from the 17th century, you get a plethora of European records, easier to reconstruct histories. But let's say in the pre-17th century world, you have essentially four types of sources, points, that is numismatics, epigraphy, sculptures, writings on stone, textual, whatever exists in fragments, and iconographic, that is sculpture, statuary, paintings, if any. Now here we have very much less epigraphical and numismatic evidence from Orissa. Some archaeological traces have been found, even in the case of stone anchors with East Africa. Again, around the Aden area, that is where the giraffe came from into Orissa. We have Orissa coast in the Chinese accounts. And here Chilka Lake is very central. There's mention of a port called Kanakapatana. And of course, we know about the giraffe from Aden that is painted on the Konarak temple wall. But we don't know whether it landed at the port for Konarak or some other Orissa port. Interestingly, Duarte Barbosa, who is a Portuguese traveler, who travels between 1506 and 1516. So he's kind of the same time as Tome Pires. We use Tome Pires and Duarte Barbosa and also Ludovica Varthema, as foreign travelers and diarists for much of the info for this period. Around 1506, on his way to Bengal, he stops at Orissa and he says, this kingdom has but few seaports and little trade. Now that's quite surprising because, Orissa really, unlike Bengal doesn't really have seaports. Bengal is not really maritime. Bengal is an estuarine. It's got the massive Ganga, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna estuary. So, Bengal coast is totally fragmented. But Orissa has a clear maritime coast. But Barbosa says few seaports and little trade. What we do know, interestingly, is that Orissa, although closer physically, distance-wise to Bengal, and of course, post-Mughal period into the British period, at least the North Orissa economy becomes very firmly hitched to the economy, British Indian economy and economy around West Bengal, Calcutta. But earlier, the coins did not follow Bengal's silverized economy. Orissa minted gold coins. And surprisingly, Bengal's mint economy by the 15th century was one of the most advanced in the Bay of Bengal. and many other states imported Bengal's mint specialists. Arakan is one, Tibet is another one, Tripura, many small states in the Himalayan foothills, imported Bengal's mint, not Tibet, beg your pardon, I meant Tripura, I made a mistake there. But Orissa, for whatever reason, does not follow Bengal's mint system, and it is closer to the mint system of the Andhra, the Vijayanagar Empire. And so it means gold coins called Gajapati pagodas. And which leads us to suspect, that most of the, whatever exchange there was carried on through barter or cowries. And these Gajapati pagodas are mainly ceremonial gold coins. Next slide, please. Now, now we come to something very interesting, that moving directly into the Andhra coast, I'm going to be talking about the lower half of the Orissa and the northern part of the Andhra block. And here, this is known as the Kalinga coast earlier. Again, the data I'm giving you is not really coming out of data written by scholars from Orissa. For whatever reasons, historians in Orissa are not very attracted to maritime history. This is from a text called the Malay Annals, which was actually compiled, I think, in the 17th century. This is the story of the Sultanate of Malacca, but it is pre-Malacca, that is all the Malay states, that rise in the area of the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula up to modern Singapore. And this annal is called the Sejarah Melayu. Now, what is very interesting in the Sejarah Melayu is that there is a story of a Raja Shula, obviously Chola. It's a mythical story, right? And he is from Nagapattinam, and he comes and he leads an expedition against Temasek. It's obviously a memory of the Chola raids on Srivijaya, but Raja Shula raid happens sometimes in the misty 11th, 12th century. Remember, these are legends. And then he goes back from Temasek. Temasek is the forerunner of modern Singapore. State formation in the Malay Peninsula is from 7th to the 11th century, Srivijaya. Then there's a gap, 12th to 13th century is Temasek. After Temasek, you have Malacca, which is moving up into today's Malaysia. And then the forerunner of modern Temasek, modern Singapore. Singapore is on the tip, lower tip of the Malay Peninsula. So we're talking about a very interesting area, the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. So on his return from Temasek, he builds a new city called Vijayanagar, but it's in a place called Kalinga, according to the Malay Annals. And obviously the name suggests, a mix-up of Orissa and the Coromandel and Andhra coast with the new kingdom of Vijayanagar. Now, the kingdom of Vijayanagar is very, very important in the history of Southeast Asia. You won't find this in the texts, but from the local legends and chronicles. The Kalinga that is referenced in the Malay Annals is the central east coast stretching from the mouth of the Mahanadi in Orissa all the way up to, let's say, Visakhapatnam. And this you will find, Vijayanagar. I will be talking about this later. I still have about 10 minutes. You look at these two borders. This is supposed to denote the Vijayanagar kingdom. There's a beautiful atlas, a map called the Atlas Miller, supposedly by a Portuguese called Lopo Homem, between 1518 and 19. And it's a pictorial atlas of India and the Indian Ocean. And this is supposed to be Vijayanagar. Next slide, please. Okay, so Temasek has very strong, I'm not going to read out from this slide. I'll just sum up the main points here. It is very, very strong relations with Kalinga, to the extent that the second ruler of Temasek seeks the hand in marriage for his son of the princess of Kalinga, who's called Talai Puchudi. And if I'm not mistaken, Puchudi, I think, is still a surname of Telugus. I have come across Kuchudis in Hyderabad. And then, the story is that she sets sail the following seasons in a ship which is sent by her prospective father-in-law, accompanied by a Kalinga war chief and 500 maids of honor. Now, this link of Temasek, 12th, 13th, 14th century Temasek with Vijayanagar is also retained by Temasek's successor, Malacca. And the Malay annals, many of you may be familiar with a term called cling, which is a kind of a commercial category. Cling is actually just a corruption of Kalinga. And many clings are made port masters or harbor masters. That's a very, very important post in Malacca. And again, here you find they're given the title of Raja Mendaliar, which could come from Mudaliar, a Tamil title, and he became one of the richest men in, not one, he became the richest man in Malacca, this Raja Mendaliar. And Kalinga, what is very interesting in the Malay annals, it's not Bengal. You normally think of Bengal as being the source of cotton textiles. The British accounts tell us that, they came to Bengal for the cotton textiles. No, it's Kalinga. That, which means, the Odisha Andhra coast. That is the source of Indian cotton textiles. When Malacca's Sultan Mahmud Shah, he needed 40 varieties of Bengal cotton textiles. He sends his courtier Hang Nadim personally there because these had to be made according to royal specifications. So we are looking at a commercial connect, we're looking at a diplomatic connect, and we're looking at a matrimonial connect. Could we move on, please? Next slide. Okay. Now, I was talking about the Vijayanagar Empire, how it was depicted on the Atlas Miller. This, of course, is Bengal. You can see the 5 mouths of the Ganges, the Ptolemies, 1st century AD, notion of the 5 mouths of the Ganges, which was actually very, very accurate because it's talking about the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. Now, this is very interesting because throughout, these are very dark skinned. They almost look African. And this was the notion in Europe that the Ethiopians were also an Indian race. So what you actually find here, are not really Vijayanagar people or Andhra people. These are Ethiopians transplanted to Indian soil in this map. Otherwise, there is a picture of the various animals. Remember, these are the animals that are exported across the Indian Ocean. Elephants, the Himalayan black bear, so on and so forth. Now, the same kind of imagery, but in a different way, is expressed in this particular map on the right-hand side. Atlas Miller is 1519, 1819. This is 1535. It's a map made in Venice by a very important map maker called Lorenz Fries. And he's marking each area as a walled city, a fortress city. So this is the Vijayanagar area, which he calls India within the Ganges. This is Ayutthaya in Siam. This is Malacca. And this is India extra Ganges without the Ganges. This is India within the Ganges. Next slide, please. Now the Andhra coast linkages, the proper Andhra coast. Let's forget the Kalinga Andhra connect for this moment. The conventional view is that after mentioning the Periplus Maris Erythrae, there is a long archaeological and epigraphical gap. We really don't know much about sailings from the Andhra coast. We know certain scattered references that the Kakatiyas went all the way up the Andhra coast, up to Bengal, and then they went all the way. There was a matrimonial alliance up to Nepal. The famous Kakatiya queen, Rudrama Devi, possibly her sister was married to her sister Viramma Devi was married to the crown prince, the Nepalese crown prince. Again, that's rather interesting then, you are looking at a connection across East Coast India into the mountain. So like Bengal, the Kakatiyas also are trying to find a connect into the Himalayan foothills and beyond. And what you certainly do have, and it's well documented in terms of archaeological artifacts, the China link in the 15th century. We have coins, ceramic shards, and broken portions of glazed tiles. Let's move on. Okay. What, of course, is very, very famous is the Buddhist link between Andhra and the points beyond. I'm not talking about Amravati here. Amravati is still a bit inland. This is Undavali on the Krishna River. And if you look at Undavali, this is a Buddhist site, of about the 4th century, not very much visited. I went there, I found it fascinating. And, like all these are not really cave temples. These are actually places, where the travelers stayed, very similar to other cave temples like Ajanta. But also, you find synergies with Dunhuang in Mongolia, in China, of the 7th century. So, as far as North India is concerned, we talk about Uttarapatha. It has been suggested that the South has something called a Dakshin Patha, a network of roadways, and that is the cotton route, as opposed to the Uttarapatha's Silk Route. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm running out of time, so I'm also nearing the end. Okay, now I've talked about the Bengal, the Orissa, and the Andhra coast. So what is the difference, from the Chola coast? Because when we do maritime India, we always tend to think about the Chola coast. I'm not going to use just the term Chola coast. Let's talk about the Tamil coast. There are certain distinctiveness that stands out. In terms of the economy, the question would be, shall we characterize it as a temple economy, agrarian economy, or a maritime economy? I think this question still needs to be resolved. Chola coast is one of the few, other than Kerala, where we find navigational practices written down. There was a scholar in Mumbai, he died 10 years ago, called B. Arunachalam. He undertook this wonderful project from the Maritime History Society of Mumbai, which is run by the Navy, of the navigational practices of the different coasts. And he has, I think, 2 books on the Chola navigational practices. How far did the Cholas, I'm asking questions here, participate in Dakshin Patha? Now, one argument as compared to Bengal or even Orissa, I get this is my gut feeling. Bengal, Orissa are more agrarian. There's not so much need for trade, and to look for money because agrarian taxes make up the bulk of their economy. But the Chola coast has fewer rivers and fewer larger river valleys as compared to Bengal and also the Orissa coast. I mean, the Chola coast is riven by rivers, but they're not very wide river valleys. But at the same time, if you look at the coast here, the Chola coast, the larger navigational space. Bengal coast, is a fragmented coast, cyclone-prone coast, and it does coastal sailing. Whatever navigation the Cholas have to do, they have to do deep sea, across into Southeast Asia. One disadvantage of the Chola coast is they don't have any connection with the uplands, the Himalayan uplands, because they're too far down. But one distinction, again, different from Orissa and certainly different from Bengal, is active encouragement to trade. And that we can see from the formation of numerous guilds. There's also, if you look at the travel literature, travel records, there's consistent, and also in the temple epigraphy, consistent references to new ports appearing through the Pallava, Chola, Pandya periods and into the Maba Sultanate, I mean, you might argue that, these names are no longer there, they're time specific. But, one port dies out, another one comes up roughly in the same area with a different name. So, this is a very highly port intensive area, this portion of Peninsula. So is the Kerala coast. And finally, one thing that's very important and that we don't find in the Orissa, and we certainly don't find it in the Andhra case, except for Vijayanagar, active horse trade from West Asia, from the Persian Gulf, from Hormuz, coming into South India, horse trade, whereas Bengal and Orissa, I think, are more reliant on elephants. Next slide quickly. So commonalities and differences. This is your Uttarapatha. This is that Portuguese 1630 atlas I referenced earlier. Bengal coast, what are the distinctions? Overland trade links to Uttarapatha and also to southwest China through Yunnan. It has a mountain trade, Himalayan foothills into Tibet. And we have also seen in the epigraphy that links with Cambodia, 10th, 11th century Khmer culture, links with Khmer culture. These are all documented. Wider river valleys, potential for agriculture, so less need for trade, maritime trade perhaps, less incentive, as I said, for maritime trade. And only one guild has come to light, it's called Vanigrama, which doesn't seem to be so much for commercial goods as for agricultural goods. And we also have the 13th century Kakatiya link up to Nepal. So this is what, we can sum up for the Bengal coast. Orissa coast is less monetized, practically non-monetized. Whatever trade there is carried on through a combination of cowries and barter. Fewer towns and ports, as according to Duarte Barbosa. Closer to the Andhra mint systems, not close to the Bengal mint system. If it doesn't have maritime trade, it probably has a trans-India, trans-South Asia trade. And of course, Orissa, you really don't see much about horse imports into Orissa. It's mainly elephants. Andhra coast, again, as I said, that there's this huge gap after the mention in the Periplus Maris Erythrae. But we can infer links with Southeast Asia from other sources. It is a historic Burma trade, not just 18th, 19th centuries, but very early on, 7th, 8th, 9th, Buddhism. The Andhra variant goes into Burma, Myanmar, and there are links in the language, in the script and the language also. It has close links with the Malay Peninsula, we just saw, as in the case of Temasek and Malacca. We have the China link with coins, ceramics, and glaze tiles, and these have particularly been found in a site called Kothapatanam, which is below the Godavari belt, roughly mid-Andhra, I would say. And we have evidence of the horse trade in Vijayanagar. Last slide, please.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So summing up very quickly, right-hand image first. This is again the 1574 map by Ruscelli, an Italian. And this is going up to Orissa and Bengal. This is a very port town, city-driven peninsular coast. And here, this is very interesting. These are the routes of two travelers, two geographers, not travelers. One is Jiadan. Jiadan is he's actually a kind of prime minister. I'm not suggesting he traveled himself, but he wrote a book on geography. He was prime minister during the Tang period. So he obviously knew a lot, what the info about the people coming in, who had traveled across West Asia into China. And so, you can see Jiadan's travels. We call it Jiadan, but it's Jiadan's time, actually. So this is Jiadan. And the other, of course, is much, much more famous. Abbasid Caliphate, Ibn Khudabbe. Both of them show that this is the most lucrative trade route of the time. And this is the Abbasid Caliphate, linking all the way up to China through Southeast Asia. This is your area of what would later be Malacca and Sumatra. And you see, so, this main route does not really touch East Coast India at all. So certain feeder routes from this would touch East Coast India. And even if it does, it will touch the Coromandel, the Tamil coast. Very rarely would it go up to the Orissa and Bengal coasts. And I think that's it. But Mr. Seshadri, before that, there's one particular slide I did want to show because it's also a general audience and it'll just take a minute. Would you just go back and I'll tell you to stop?
Yeah.
Go back. Yeah. Okay, go back.
This
Okay.
one?
No, go back one slide. Okay. Now, this is something, I always used to argue in class, that this was Changhe's route, right? From China through Southeast Asia into India. This is, of course, a truncated. This is actually an image which was given to me by my colleague Tansen. So he only did the image up to India, East Coast India. I don't know why. But if you go on to the next slide, what is very, very interesting, next slide, please. Okay. This is the same road as China's Belt and Road Initiative. And this is, the Belt and Road Initiative is, moving in spits and spurts. So this is from the Hindu, this is your route of Changha, 1405-35, right? And this is from the Hindu, 2022. So it's reasonably recent. Same route. Huh? The only interesting thing is the maritime route is in pink, but the overland route, this is actually, obviously in Changha's time, it wasn't there. This is your old Silk Route. I didn't bring the Silk Route at all. So this is much, much more diversified Silk Route. But the fascinating, it's really fantastic, I'm not subscribing to it by any term, but think of the visual capacities of this road. It's really a belt. It will embrace around Venice, and going up to Spain. They've not been very successful. Italy, they've been successful. Spain, no, for whatever reason. Remember, Corona first came from Italy. Yeah, in Milan, that cloth factory was owned by the Chinese. And after the Chinese New Year, they went and kissed the Chinese, and the Chinese had come back from Wuhan. And then the Italians came to India, to Delhi, and infected India. So this is the story. But the blue and the pink, if it links up, it'll be much, much more than just Changha's route. But what is fascinating in Chinese geopolitics is what was dreamed up in 1405, 600 years later, still happened. Right. So thank you very much.
Quite interesting. In fact, I was about to talk about the Silk Route. One of my questions was going to be on, we see so much about Silk Route in the popular literature, but we don't talk about a sea route in the same, in the same, let's say, currency, right? The Belt and Road Initiative is another interesting thing that I will come to next. But if there was so much happening, particularly during the Ottoman period, where you are connecting all the way from Malacca to, leaving out the East Coast, but going all the way, why is it not talked about in a big way, like the popularity around Silk Route?
What, you mean the overland Silk Route versus the maritime?
Right.
See, the overland Silk Route starts much earlier now, Han period. And it continues in fits and starts. But remember one thing though, Silk Route, what the term that we use now, was actually coined by Richthofen in the 19th century. There was no Silk Route. It's a term coined by Ferdinand von Richthofen, who was a German geographer and explorer in the 19th century. Until then, it was a series of roads. So it did not have that image of a composite road, which you are thinking of now. Whereas the maritime road, is somewhat a bit more glamorous, all these ships and galleys. And I think the overland Silk Route was equally glamorous. I wish, this was maritime, so I didn't do it. In the Catalan Atlas, 1293, 1305, I think. The famous Catalan Atlas, which is derived on Marco Polo. There's a whole picture in that map of Marco Polo's caravan.
Okay.
But once the sea route is discovered, the Silk Route somehow goes out of popular imagination.
Okay. Interesting. There are a few questions from the audience. So one is on one of your early images where you showed a lion attacking a person, and also a lady opening sort of a closed window. Ramji wants to know, what is the connection to that and the maritime travel?
I don't think there's any connection at all. I mean,
Okay.
the reason I was showing it,
Oh,
if I can explain to Mr. Ramji a little bit, is remember I first said I was trying to move away from trade and traders and trade goods. I was
okay.
trying to show perceptions on the coast, how people saw the
Right.
world around them.
Right.
And first I said it's a sacred coast, a world of exchange, but it's also a violent world. And it was in that context I showed the lady with the window and the lion devouring the man.
Okay. 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 Fine. So the next question is also from him, where he's asking about the maritime circulation between Bengal and Tamil Nadu. For example, copper from Tamralipti via sea, most South Indian bronzes couldn't have happened at all. So what kind of maritime trade existed between Bengal and Tamil Nadu?
Okay, now in terms of definite items, I would not really be qualified to talk about. I do know that there is a treatise dating from about the 10th century. It's a Tamil treatise, I can't give you the name offhand, but Vangam is always very clearly mentioned. So even one of the maps, it said Vangal Desam, so we might think, that Tamil Nadu, Bengal really so far apart. They were certainly trading in certain items. Remember that one, of course, a fascination for the Tamil coast for Bengal, other than the metal, is the Ganges. For Cholas, that Gangaikonda Cholapura,
Right.
the Ganges, and 1025, there is this campaign, to subdue Govinda Chandra of the in Bengal, Eastern Bengal. So there is this Bengal connect, but in terms of metals, I really am not the person qualified to talk about. So my apologies to this gentleman who asked this question.
So
Sorry, but if you find out, let me know.
Yeah, there's also, of course, the in Rajaraja's time and subsequently in Rajendra's time, a lot of priestly class came from the Gangetic region.
Shaivism.
So that religious connection is also there. Right. There's a question from Babu. When talking about the Odisha maritime history, one of the interesting documents is the Madala Panji of Puri Temple Chronicles. Does this give any mention of maritime visitors, gifts, battles, and so on?
I don't know. I have no idea about this.
Okay. So that's the Temple Chronicles, which details temple construction, rituals, etc. Maybe.
One issue, and this is really something I would like to talk about. We certainly have a maritime blindness. That's why I'm very happy that THT is at least doing this maritime week, so to speak. But even now that the books are written, there is no whiff of the sea in any of the books, history book. And for whatever reason, our colleagues from Orissa have been extremely negligent in doing anything remotely maritime from the Orissa coast. The only thing is some archaeologists like Sila Tripathi, etc., in Goa, that National Institute of Archaeology, Oceanic Archaeology or whatever, they do some work. But others just deal with the 18th century English factory port towns, but I think Orissa, the Andhra archaeologists and historians, or at least the Telugus, are now, moving into this gap. But the Oriya scholars are rather negligent in this. And until they do it, they have the language. What can we do? We can just compile the knowledge.
Right. If it needs interpreting a lot of texts and inscriptions, it requires local scholarship, certainly.
Yeah. See, that is the problem of working on any particular region in India. That's why you'll find in the universities, public universities, Gujaratis will work on their region, Bengalis will work on their region, because the language is a deterrent.
Right. That's true. There's a comment from Vaijayanti Kare. She says the ACM and Malaysian Heritage Museum in Singapore narrate and depict all this Tamasik, Kalinga, Indian East Coast beautifully. She's just mentioning that.
I think it's called the Asian Civilizations Museum.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one more question from Bhanu Murthy.
Can I just add on to what Vaijayanti said? Just
Yes,
if I can
please.
have a moment.
Yeah.
Because I think we can go up till 8:30, right?
Yeah. We have time. No problem.
Yeah. So Vaijayanti, I'd also like to say, that other than the Asian Civilizations Museum, of course, you rightly pointed out a wonderful, wonderful collection. And they also mount very nice periodic exhibitions and also textiles. I did not talk about textiles at all. I purposely kept away from specialist areas.
Okay.
Like Lotika Varadarajan, Hema Devare, they've all worked on, Indian, Southeast Asian textiles. Just as, I kept away from the metallurgy question. But other than the Asian Civilizations Museum, I think Singapore is now hosting permanently the wreck, the Belitung wreck. This was the 849 wreck that came from West Asia all the way to China, and on the way back sank somewhere off the coast of Indonesia. And I first, in fact, saw the Belitung exhibition in Singapore, and then it toured. It was also very controversial because they use salvage archaeologists. We're talking about big money, right? I mean, excavating a shipwreck is always big money. No university archaeologist will be funded for this. So anyway, now it's permanently there in Singapore. And it doesn't have much on East Coast India, but what it does have is fabulous glaze stuff from West Asia, also connected with stuff from China, and which they were sailing back to West Asia with when they sank off the Indonesia coast. Yes, so next question, please.
Yeah. Deba Ranjan from Bhubaneswar. He has two questions for you. One, we've been listening more about maritime trade in Odisha. Who were these communities or castes who are going abroad by ship? We have weaving communities. Are they Odisha-based foreign merchants? That's his first question. The second question also I'll ask, so you can answer them both together. Do you have any recorded history of cyclones in Bay of Bengal? Now we have more frequency of cyclones. In epics, we are not finding much mentioned about cyclones. So I'm interested in knowing this.
Okay, so two questions. Okay, in terms of your caste and communities, what we have, there is nothing specifically singling out people from Orissa as Orias. They are all collectively called klings. This is why I kept talking about the Kalinga Andhra connect, purposely, because, modern divisions, political divisions are not going to, match the divisions that we are talking about in an earlier time. For example, the Vijayanagar Empire, would technically have a bit of southern Odisha, Andhra coast, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, almost encroaching up to the Tamil Nadu.
Tamil Nadu was almost entirely in.
So, Vijayanagar is practically, other than Bengal, the whole thing is Vijayanagar.
Right.
So, these modern divisions are very problematic. Now, Oriya merchants, it is like, even if you look at your Bali Yatra and all that, where they said that Gopalpur was the place of Bali Yatra, but that is really a fabrication by the government of Orissa. They just built up they found an old jetty and they said this is where they set off from. My impression of East Coast India is you have a lot of what I call accidental anchorages. You don't always need port cities, Port cities are always... Actually, if you think about it, in Orissa, you can't really locate a port city. Tamralipta, Sadgaon, Hooghly. But what would you call the port city of Odisha? Konarak, maybe? Puri Jagannath is 11th century. So before 11th through 13th century, we don't find a port city. Even if you look at the Periplus mentioned...
This was a question that I raised. There was another person also who raised the question, why nothing is mentioned in Periplus from the Odisha coast?
There's actually also very little about Andhra.
Right.
A Telugu archaeologist said, ma'am, whatever we have is a little bit in the Periplus, but after that, there's total silence. Except Ptolemy mentions, not Periplus, but, when he talks about Andhra Mandara, Andhra is supposed to be Andhra. But no, now to get back to the question on communities and castes, So they're called clings, so there's nothing to differentiate them as being from Orissa. But the second question about cyclones is something I find very interesting. Yeah. You do find reference to cyclones in the Bay of Bengal, but for this you have to comb through are you planning a research proposal by any chance? If you are, it's hard work. But most of these travelers' accounts are e-books. So there are references to cyclones.
Okay.
But there are references to cyclones mainly of people like Federici coming from Southeast Asia, from Pegu to the Bengal coast. So most of the refs I have are for the Bengal coast. Orissa coast references you do get from the 18th, 19th century onwards from the British records. But they all say that the frequency of cyclones and also cyclone modeling was much, much more in the Bay of Bengal earlier than the Arabian Sea. But now, as I said, they're almost evenly matched.
Well, I think what his underlining question was that the frequency of cyclones near or around the coast of Odisha has significantly increased in the modern time.
Well, I'm not a climatologist, so I'm not
Okay.
to comment on that.
Sir, there's a question from Banu Murthy. She wants to know whether you have written about the marriage link between the Kakatiya Rudrama Devi and a Nepalese person.
This I just found in a reference, and it was from Nepal. And then I didn't just trust one reference because sometimes the scholarship is a bit dodgy, So I tried to track it. I did not find any supporting documents or references for this, and certainly not in the Kakatiya epigraphy. So I didn't write about it. But Kakatiyas, I should also just mention, since we were talking about the Kakatiyas, I wanted to bring it in. They were quite proactive to trade. Remember the Motupalli inscription, where they say the traders will be protected, goods confiscated, they will not be taxed unfairly, so on and so forth.
You also showed that Undavalli caves. What was I couldn't get that inference about how was that related to the maritime trade or anything to do with maritime in the Andhra coast.
I wasn't, this is the problem, we can't get away from trade.
Right.
We keep thinking of trade. I was actually, you'll see that I avoided the term trade very consciously. I talked about circulations. I talked about maritime circulations. And, I'm sure Andrea Acri would, I don't know if he's still there.
No, he seems to be there, but I don't know whether he's following.
But, there is this thing of maritime Buddhism now. Our traditional idea is Buddhism spreads into Central Asia overland, right? But there is this idea of maritime sutras and maritime circulation of Buddhism. So, Undavalli, you might think, is a bit inland because it's on the Krishna River. It's not very far from the coast. That is why I showed it. And also the synergy with the overland world of Dunhuang, which is very, very far from any sea, unimaginable.
Okay. So Andrea says he's there. Maybe he can add a comment of your own, Andrea, if you can come on video. If you are available and ready, you can say something about that in the maritime sutras and...
Yes, I'm here, sorry, but I actually not clear about the, again, the point being made. If you can repeat briefly.
Yeah, you, Professor Mukherjee, you want to just repeat your comment so that Andrea can also...
Oh yeah, hi Andrea. No, Mr. Shishalji asked me, he was not very sure why I showed a particular slide of the Undavalli case, because he wanted to know how it was linked to maritime trade. So I said that, I've been consciously trying to avoid or escape the trade category and looking at maritime circulations instead. And so in terms of maritime circulations, although my presentation doesn't cover the Buddhist circuit or the Buddhist period as such, I felt that, there is this category which you are very familiar with, which is maritime Buddhism as opposed to overland Buddhism, the Jason Neely's brand of Buddhism. So that is why I showed Undavalli.
Yeah. Indeed, yes. I mean, what can I say? Actually, I'm not very familiar with those cases. I was very intrigued when you showed the slide. But I take your point. I mean, I agree with you. I am also trying to shift away the attention from trade to other dynamics, diplomacy, royal elements. As you said, also military was there, So I agree. And yes, maritime Buddhism category, I think it is helpful in a way, So I really use the work of historians like you and archaeologists to put together all the pieces in the puzzle. And this is what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mukherjee, for a very interesting overview of the Eastern Coast. We did hear about the Western Coast over the last couple of days, and we were raising some questions about the Eastern Coast, saying why nothing is mentioned. For example, in terms of the local navy that the Western Coast had, nothing equivalent of that existed. Sorry.
No, you're correct. You're absolutely correct. This is something we, who do East Coast India.
Right.
You have a very continuous historical tradition for the Western Indian Ocean. So when you talk about West Coast India, it partakes of the Western Indian Ocean. Right from the time of the Greek and Roman and Egyptian notices, all the way up to Islam. They're great record keepers, right?
Right.
Then you come into the East. Now, we Indians are extremely sloppy record keepers. So the only records we get are the Chinese. And they are not necessarily always very, can't always rely on them, right?
Right.
Like all records, of course.
Right.
But we actually have very little for India. For those who do Southeast Asia, as Andrea would tell you, they're not dealing with written records. They are inferring from non-textual evidence, artifacts, so on and so forth. So this is what I've tried to do for East Coast India. What I've also tried to do here is I have tried to raise the gaps so that if anybody is listening who wants to do research can at least come in at some point and pick on those areas. So I'm glad if you found it useful. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. Pleasure making your acquaintance, Mr. Seshadri, online, and Andrea, you too, of course, have read you and used you, if I may use that term, extensively, but very nice to see you online. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Krishna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukherjee,
Bye.
throwing light on the maritime worlds or the maritime circulations of Bengal, Odisha, and the Andhra coast. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night. With that, we come to a wrap on today's program, Day 5 program. Tomorrow, Saturday, we have two lectures, just like the past 5 days. Same time, 5:30 p.m. We have Dr. Y. Subrayulu talk about the epigraphical evidence of maritime relations of South India and Rajendra Chola's naval expeditions. Following that, Dr. Gauri Krishnan speaks about the story of Indian textile trade from Cairo to Malacca. Same time, 5:30 p.m. We should start, and we should be ending tomorrow's program like all other days at 8:30 p.m. So please do join us. It's a weekend, so please do join us and pass on the YouTube links to your friends who may not be aware of this program. Thank you and good night.